All right, thank you everyone. My name is David Kinsey. I'm the Director of International Investments at Thun Financial Creative Planning, and I'm joined today by my colleague Peter Sengelman, who is the Chief Investment Officer for Thun Financial, dealing with the international clients of creative planning. And we are very happy to have such strong attendance at today's webinar. I know this is a critical issue for many of you, and I'm sure we're going to have a very good, productive presentation and then question and answer session. Of course, we are talking about the account closing crisis that American expats all around the world are experiencing, and we're going to dig right into it today. Initially with an introduction to our firm, then we're going to start talking about the experience of many Americans abroad in terms of what they're having done with their accounts, closures, restrictions, and so on and so forth. We're going to specifically address mutual fund and ETF restrictions. We're going to spend a fair bit of time on the specifics of the EU MiFID II regulations that have restricted a lot of access for Americans in the EU. And then we're going to talk about the solutions that you're able to execute on your own or in conjunction with working with us to deal with this and to get around these restrictions and closures and still invest effectively. And then at the end, we're just going to touch on the really big issues which come after you get your accounts open. Right now, we get into the complex issues of taxes and planning, investing across borders, which we cover in many additional webinars and seminars that we do. But today, we're going to be focusing on the specifics of this account problem, which affects so many of you. And then at the end, we're going to open it up for questions and answers. You can go ahead right now and begin putting in your questions into the question box. We will attempt to get through all of the questions. We have extraordinarily high attendance for today's webinar, so we're going to have a lot of questions. I hope we'll get through all of them. We'll try, and if not, of course, you can always contact us directly and we'll go over your specifics. All right, let's get going with today's presentation. I want to start telling you a little bit more about our firm for those of you who are not familiar with Thun Financial and Creative Planning. We are an investment management and financial planning firm that works with clients throughout the United States and outside of the United States. The Thun Group is the group within creative planning that works with non-residents of the United States and what we would call cross-border families. We provide comprehensive approaches to building long-term wealth, customized for the needs of our expatriate clients, and of course, on the creative planning side for clients inside the United States, with direct investment management integrated with detailed financial planning. Our client base, not surprisingly, is very global. We work with clients in over 65 countries. Creative planning is a registered investment advisor with the Securities and Exchange Commission. We operate as a fiduciary for our clients, and that's true for both creative planning and Thun. Thun is effectively creative planning, and we all operate at the level of the fiduciary standard for our clients inside or outside the United States, by the way. Creative planning itself is ranked consistently as one of the top U.S. investment advisors and independent wealth managers in the country. It manages, as of March 31st, 2021, over $75 billion in assets. We have offices in over 20 states. As I mentioned, we are fiduciary to our clients. And the main custodians that we use are TD Ameritrade, Schwab, Pershing, and Fidelity. And we'll talk more about that with respect to the international aspects of custody of assets and so on and so forth. All right, the Thun team within the larger creative planning, you can see here, we are, 16 wealth managers and financial planners, all of whom have deep experience in the critical areas of investing and financial planning and accounting and law, all the technical skills we need to deliver superior investment outcomes for our clients around the world. But we have deep experience in the international realm as well at the personal and professional level. Many of us have lived much of our lives outside the United States. We're multinational households. We've been in your shoes, having lived outside the United States and have been denied services or had difficulty investing and so forth. So we know how to build effective portfolio strategies and plan, but we also understand the conundrum that you face as Americans abroad because we've lived it. And I think that that's one of the reasons we have a very unique perspective and allows us to deliver a really, really unique service. We've been recognized by all of these media outlets for our expertise. I myself, David Kins, was contributor to for a long time to the Wall Street Journal's Expat forum, and so we're very proud of that. But let's get into the substance of today's presentation. I'm going to start talking about the U.S. domestic sources of this problem. Then I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Peter, who's going to pick it up in a few minutes, talking about the non-U.S. factors that are contributing to this complex problem of opening and maintaining accounts, financial accounts for Americans outside the United States. So what is it we're seeing? Okay, Americans are facing broad closure and restrictions on investment accounts. This covers everything from brokerage accounts to IRA accounts to Roth accounts, 401k accounts, 403b accounts. In many cases, it includes just regular bank accounts, although the banking services are generally more available for Americans abroad. The restrictions are most heavily focused on anything investment related. How did this come about? Well, the closures began outside of the United States with some big waves in Europe and Asia, with foreign institutions closing accounts for Americans, and because of the reaction to the FATCA law, which was passed in 2010. But then subsequently, we have been seeing a much broader wave of American financial institutions also denying service, and we're going to talk about why that is. So why are these American financial institutions now following their European counterparts and cutting off Americans abroad? Well, what are we seeing from the U.S. institutions? Let's talk about that. So as we've said, we're seeing account closures, we're seeing restrictions on mutual funds and ETFs. We're seeing some institutions continuing to serve but requiring very high minimum balances. In other cases, we're seeing firms like UBS and Merrill Lynch forcing anyone who resides outside the United States to move their accounts, if they're still eligible, to a specialized group in New York or Miami. In other cases, some firms are even saying you can stay with us, but only if you restrict your interaction with your advisor or agent or with the bank itself while you are physically in the United States, or appoint a power of attorney to someone who is in the United States. These kinds of things are really quite amazing, and it's amazing the scope of the hoops that people are being asked to jump through. Where is this happening? It's really happening across virtually all U.S. financial institutions. Fidelity, Charles Schwab, I highlight those and asterisk them because those are the firms that we use, and we do use them, and we are able to use them very effectively for our clients all around the world in virtually every country, and I'm going to come back. But for retail investors, that is people who are dealing with those institutions directly, depending upon the country, depending upon the nature of the relationship, and depending upon the instrument that the investor is trying to invest in, even Schwab and Fidelity are restricting many, if not most, Americans outside the United States. Other firms, Merrill Lynch, Morgan Stanley, have virtually cut off Americans abroad, except with very high account balances. JP Morgan, UBS, Wells Fargo, pretty much the same story. We're going to talk about Wells Fargo because that's a new case. Ameriprise, TI, Vanguard, Citibank, all of these firms have been slowly ratcheting up over the last few years restrictions or outright closures of accounts for Americans outside the United States. I want to highlight Wells Fargo in this context because it was announced a couple of months ago, and now we're hearing about it every day from calls to our office, that accounts at Wells Fargo for all Americans or all non-residents of the United States are being closed. Wells Fargo has made an announcement that they will not service anyone outside of the United States anymore. And this is a pretty big deal because in most cases there is some kind of patchwork of this country yes, that country no, this amount yes, this amount no. But with Wells Fargo, they have gone just completely in the direction of no service for anyone under any circumstances outside of the United States. I hope it's not a trend that continues, but it's affecting a lot of people who work with Wells Fargo, and we need to monitor this as a precedent for other institutions. Okay, why is this happening? Right? People call up all the time and say, why is this happening? And you know, there is no simple answer. It's been a process that's evolved over the last 2 decades, really, and it has a lot of different elements to it. Let's begin. It really kind of began with the 2003 Patriot Act in the United States, which resulted in financial institutions being required by U.S. regulators to really ramp up what's known as your KYC, know your client rules. And many financial institutions looked at those new rules that came out of the Patriot Act and basically concluded that the cost for us to know our client to the level that the U.S. Treasury is demanding of us would require so much due diligence and compliance work that it's just not possibly worth it. So if you're outside the United States, we can't know you well enough to meet the standards, so we're just going to cut you off. And you saw at that early stage some significant waves of account closures and restrictions. But the big change came in 2010 when FATCA came out. FATCA, the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, was a huge legislative work that was designed to focus not on U.S. financial institutions, but on foreign financial institutions who have accounts for Americans. And it required those institutions to start reporting directly on accounts held by Americans outside the United States to the IRS so they could monitor and enforce, of course, tax payments from those accounts. And what we saw is that the reaction outside the United States to FATCA that Peter will talk about further led to non-U.S. institutions as well as U.S. financial institutions concluding that the cost of compliance and the direction of the regulatory environment is going to make it just way too difficult for us to comply, and the easiest solution for this is to restrict or terminate our business with people outside the United States, whether they're American citizens or non-residents, this cross-border business, as we like to call it. They continued to ramp this up. In 2014, there was a whole new series of regulations that came out of the FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Unit of the U.S. Treasury, with regards to KYC and anti-money laundering. That got a lot of industry press at the time and further focused the compliance offices of big financial institutions on the problems of dealing with people outside the United States. And so all this regulatory, new regulatory environment just at each stage resulted in a ramp up of more and more restrictions being imposed by U.S. financial institutions and the closure of accounts outside the United States. Okay, now, that's a kind of a history of the U.S. rules, right? But a parallel process has been going on outside of the United States in large degree in reaction to the ramp up of the U.S. regulations, but also because institutions, regulators, governments in Europe and Asia have also been focusing on trying to clamp down on money laundering, tax avoidance, and so on and so forth. So they have now been implementing corresponding restrictions or regulatory guidelines that have further compelled financial institutions inside the United States and outside the United States to restrict generally cross-border financial transactions, and Americans abroad are, of course, getting caught up in that. From here, I'm going to turn it over to Peter, who's now going to be starting to talk about the non-U.S. factors.
Thank you, David. I gotta say, this whole topic hits very close to home. The whole reason how I even met David in the first place was because I was an American abroad, had an account at Wells Fargo, and found out that my account was going to be subject to seizure and sent to the U.S. government as a donation. This was a retirement account if I didn't evidence that I was still living. And so I reached out to David, and here I am now talking to you about it. So very excited to be here, share my personal experience with you, and help you avoid the same issue that I faced a number of years ago I'm going to talk about, as David pointed out, sort of the other side of the coin, the non-U.S. side, and what we're calling here GATCA, the Global Account Tax Compliance. It's just a term we came up with. I mean, it's sort of all-encompassing. It's not really a technical term. The first technical term that really arose in response to FATCA was the OECD Common Reporting Standard. And that actually is a really interesting one. At that time, I was living abroad, and I saw how that affected countries in terms of their ability to enforce tax collection. There's, tax compliance is not necessarily so strong in certain jurisdictions, and this common reporting standard, which the U.S. is not part of, by the way, helped those countries enforce. And in this case, the countries involved, the one that had announced a tax amnesty saying, hey, if you repatriate money from overseas, we'll give you a very low tax rate. Don't worry about it, bring it in. General consensus was nobody is going to take advantage of that. They've tried that before. Who cares? The money's offshore. The citizens are safe, those wealthy citizens hiding money offshore. Well, lo and behold, because of this common reporting standard, the take-up of that tax amnesty was substantially larger than expected. So what this really is saying is it's an information sharing agreement between countries, just like FATCA is an agreement that, well, I don't know how much of an agreement, but the US imposes to say, hey, if you have a US taxpayer in your midst, you got to share their information with us. Well, here common reporting is going more bilateral. You're citizens of my country, I share the information, etc. Now, the EU then followed up with their own rules. Here we have GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. This is more in relation to protecting its citizens around marketing tactics and so forth. But then they expanded that, not GDPR specifically, but the general regulatory environment. So that already heightened the regulatory environment in the EU. And then they went on to the securities side and launched MiFID II in 2018. Now, of course, that means there was a MiFID I, but MiFID II is the one that really hit home, and we're going to dive into a little in a little more detail. And ultimately, what this is all leading to is just a general heightened environment of cross-border compliance, right? And this is affecting people in the U.S., outside the U.S., U.S. citizens, non-U.S. citizens in general. Now, we talked about a few minutes ago the issue with U.S. mutual funds. So let's dive into that a little bit more. So here we say the title of this slide: foreign address equals no mutual funds. And here we're really referring to specifically U.S. mutual funds for people outside the United States, kind of going, hey, when I lived in, I don't know where, Nebraska previously, I was fine, and then I moved abroad, and now suddenly I can't get access to buy more shares of this fund or that fund. And mutual funds have been around for a number of decades. They're a great investment tool, and so why are they being restricted to people who just happen to be living outside the U.S. and maybe you're a U.S. citizen and feeling very frustrated, like, hey, I know the tax rules. I want to stay invested in U.S. mutual funds. It's the biggest market. They're the lowest cost, et cetera, and I'm just being prevented from doing so. Well, as I look at this as a sales process issue, and really it's about the mutual fund companies restricting the distribution of their investment vehicles, their products, if you can call them that, to the jurisdiction that they're in, which is the United States, subject to SEC rules. Now, fortunately, exchange traded funds, which are a newer invention than mutual funds and work, in our view, in many ways better than mutual funds, are more wide open. So generally speaking, if you're outside the United States, regardless of citizenship and residence and so forth, you can generally buy an exchange traded fund in the United States. And conversely, if you're in the US, you can generally buy an exchange traded fund outside the US. I'm not saying you can always, every brokerage firm offers this to you. I'm saying generally in terms of the limits. Now, the one big exception there, of course, is the EU, and we'll dive into that in a few more minutes. And really what's happened here, this environment, what's changing is that these old rules, as these new regulations that David and I have been talking about, are passed and so forth, there's been more attention on these issues. And then technology is helping the regulators and the brokerage firms who, and oftentimes are responsible for enforcing some of these rules, tax withholdings, and make sure distribution is according to the laws and all those sorts of things. Technology is helping implement those rules. And so it's making this harder and harder for people around the world to operate in sort of a laissez-faire way, saying, hey, it doesn't really matter, et cetera. Now it's more difficult, right? And about IP tracking and those sorts of things, internet protocol, right? Where you log into the accounts and all those sorts of things. It's, as technology improves, I think you're going to find that things are getting a little more difficult as time passes. Let's talk about MiFID II in more detail. So MiFID II, Markets and Financial Instruments Directive. This is a regulation that is broad-reaching. It's general EU regulation. It's not specific to retail investors. I remember I was working for a European investment firm, and they were talking about this from the perspective of institutional investing versus the research that we receive from the sell side, from the brokerage firms, et cetera, right? And that was on the institutional side, but it has a retail side to it. So what is this all about? On the retail side, that means the individual investor side, it's all about protecting you and me, right? We don't want to get the wool pulled over our eyes. We don't want that sales guy to come out and sell us some terrible thing. So the EU, right, looking to protect its residents, not its citizens, right? We're not talking about Germans and Italians and French. We're talking about anyone who's in their jurisdiction, on their territory, right, is registered there, has to comply to this regulation. And the regulation talks about the packaged retail and investment and insurance products, which is all encompassing of any type of product. So that's mutual funds, UCITS is a type of vehicle out there, exchange traded funds, annuities, life insurance, et cetera. And what do they need? They need a key investor information document. This is a simple document that gives you an analysis of forward-looking returns. So you can expect, you know what to expect when you invest these products. Now, that's great if you're an EU resident, non-US taxpaying person. What's not great is if you happen to be a US taxpayer, regardless of you're a US citizen, a green card holder, or just married filing jointly with another US taxpayer, if you're an elective US taxpayer. If you're a US taxpayer in any event, you absolutely do not want to be buying into non-US investment products. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. But for now, I just want to highlight, why would these kids, which is a funny acronym for it, some people abbreviate it actually KID, and so we're going to refer to it as kids, yeah? Why are these kids working well in Europe, but not so well? Why can't we get these for, if I'm telling you that you need, as a US taxpayer, need to buy US investments, why can't you just have a US investment with the kid? Well, the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission of the United States, specifically prohibits forward-looking statements about performance, which is a requirement of the kid, and therefore you're not going to get a kid with a US investment with an SEC registered instrument. But let's talk about, what are we going to do, right, about if you're a US investor, right? So I started talking about that limitation. Now, I talked about technology as well, and I mentioned that the technology is passing through, or the requirement on enforcing these rules, excuse me, is passing through the brokerage firms, and they're using technology to implement these. So in simple terms, they prohibit the sale of US investment products to people registered in the EU through their platforms, right? So if you're an investor, if you're in the EU and you have an account at any of the brokerage firms that David mentioned, they're going to block you from getting access to non-EU registered investments. But there's a couple of exceptions to this rule. And so I want to touch on those, because this is not the end all. The first thing is, I talked about how it's a sales process. They're protecting you from the sale, from getting sold a bag of coal. Well, those exchange traded funds for a U.S. taxpayer that you were previously able to get access to when you're resident in the EU before this MiFID II, and now no longer available to you, are still available to the likes of us. We're not in the EU, we're not subject to EU regulations. So we can actually invest in those on behalf of clients who are registered in the EU, because the sale is taking place in the SEC's land, not under the tent of the EU regulators. There's actually another way. If you don't want to work with an investment advisor such as ourselves, who is located outside the EU and not subject to those rules, you could get yourself qualified as a professional client at some of the brokerage firms. Now, I understand that's a very difficult thing to do. You have to engage in a lot of transactions. You have to certain account minimums. You have to prove that you're knowledgeable, a certain amount of experience, et cetera. But I just want full disclosure, let you know that this is another avenue you can go down. So our experience has been, because we've been operating for over a decade in this cross-border space, is that most of the brokerage firms are just taking a simple, sort of on-off approach, black and white. If you're in the EU, you're blocked. There's no sort of, finesse to that, but not all of them. And fortunately, the brokerage firms that we work with and partner with, Schwab, Fidelity, and Pershing, have read into the details of the law that says that we can still operate on behalf of our clients. So this MiFID II has actually had zero impact on us operating, but has had impact directly for people trying to transact an account on their own.
Oh goodness, we've lost Peter. Peter may have some internet connections, I would imagine.
They're efficient, they're well diversified, they're transparent. They tick all the boxes for being a great investment. And then fortunately, they're widely available, right? However, again, we talked about the MiFID II, but that notwithstanding, they're generally widely available. That's one route you could go, right? This is beyond Europe. I mean, just general expat advice. If you can't get access to US mutual funds, you need to be investing into US investment products if you're a US taxpayer, right? Then you could use ETFs in the United States. You should have no issues getting access to those. Again, MiFID II being the one exception to that for the people in Europe, unless they circumvent it. The second thing here you could do, you could buy individual stocks and bonds, right? That actually works. I mean, individual stocks and bonds are efficient from a tax point of view. They're burdensome, however, I will admit, right? Because you got to go, especially if you have a foreign brokerage account, you have to go sum up all your dividends and your capital gains and do all that stuff yourself. Because very few foreign brokerage firms are going to produce 1099s for a US taxpayer. But even if you did it in the United States, it can be quite of a cumbersome process to get the proper global diversification in your investment allocation. I mean, individual stocks and bonds, it's a lot of heavy lifting. A temporary solution would be if you're just moving abroad, right, and you have an account with the US address on there, perhaps you can retain that address for the time being until you come up with a more permanent solution. But what absolutely does not work is you absolutely do not want to start buying foreign investment products, right? So, this was popular for me. In fact, the foreign life insurance, the unit investment trusts, those sort of insurance wrapped investment products, when I was living abroad, the bankers were approaching me with that sort of thing. Oh, this is great. It's a wonderful investment. Fortunately, I had a US tax advisor who said, don't touch that, because the taxes you'll pay on that, plus the charges I will charge you just to report it properly as a passive foreign investment company investment, will exceed the gains you will make on that investment. So don't touch. So that's what this US PFIC, passive foreign investment company, that acronym is referring to. Offshore investment solutions, be careful and be very wary about these things, because if you're a US taxpayer, The US doesn't like, Uncle Sam is not a big fan of foreign stuff. He looks at those as tax shelters and applies punitive taxation to those things. And then lastly, you know, we hear about multi-pensions. People are recommending multi-pensions. Some of them do it because that works for that jurisdiction that they're in, to roll your whatever pension to a multi-pension, et cetera. Doesn't work from a US context. Don't go there. Further questions on that, reach out to us. So let's talk about the financial lives of Americans outside the US. David and I both lived through this. So we're talking to you both firsthand experience and then, you know, living vicariously through the vast number of clients that we work with around the world. What we're talking about today really is just getting over that initial hump, right? The first hurdle of getting your account open and established and able to get access to the right types of investments for you that are gonna, you know, work for you from a tax point of view and a compliance point of view. And are you getting, if you're in the UK, or getting UK reporting funds, but I'm an American, and how do I deal with all these things, right? It's complicated. That's step one, but that's only really the beginning. That is actually also incredibly, I mean, we have a whole webinar on that topic, but that's the relatively easy part. Now the fun just begins, right? So the work that we do thereafter, because we've kind of solved that issue, quite frankly. So we don't have that issue for our clients, right? Clients working with us, accounts open, no problem. Maintaining them, no problem. Getting access to the right types of investments, no problem. So that's today's webinar. That problem, we've got it dialed in. Let's go on to the harder part from our point of view. The harder part is all the work we do around compliance, around FATCA, around FBAR reporting, PFIX, foreign trust rules. We look at currency factors for clients. In fact, we have a whole currency webinar coming up. I'll talk to you about that in a second. We spend a lot of time researching tax treaties and the implications for clients that are subject to dual jurisdiction taxation. That often means somebody who's a US taxpayer resident in a foreign country. We look at the effects of our portfolio design and how it's affected by those various tax treaties and the currency implications thereof. We spent a lot of time looking at Social Security and Medicare and totalization agreements. These, you know, people living outside the United States who are US taxpayers, they get foreign earned income exclusions, foreign tax credits. If they're self-employed, do they have to pay FICA taxes? All that goes into a lot of the analysis and how it flows through to US retirement accounts, how it flows through to where we're going to asset locate for you. Should we hold this investment in this account or this investment in that account? Should you even be contributing to that investment? Spend a lot of time on cross-border estate planning because, of course, we're in the business of helping clients invest and grow their wealth, right? Protect it and grow it. So ultimately, that might mean there's going to be a transitional wealth from one generation to the next or one individual to the next. And so we spent a lot of time on cross-border estate planning because it's complicated, a very difficult topic. Talk to clients about probate, the implications of should you pass away here or there and what's going to happen to your investments and how it's going to flow through. Because of our business, the nature of our business, we have clients who are US citizens and non-US citizens, both resident in the United States, outside the United States. We have people who have nothing to do with the US who are clients and only facing the tax rules of their jurisdiction where they reside, and then other people who are sort of the spouses or partners of, you know, a US tax-paying client, and how do we optimize that situation. And then lastly, on this slide, we talk about expatriation because from time to time, the US rules really, you know, weigh down on people's minds and they sort of say, hey, enough is enough. I'm out. I'm tapping out. I want to just tell you, this is a big warning. Maybe I should have put big red on the slide here. Don't do that willy-nilly. That requires a lot of strategy, and sometimes the strategy will take years to put together before you actually ultimately expatriate. So before you expatriate, you know, research that issue, reach out to us, talk to an expatriation tax person or a tax attorney, and let's have a conversation because it is a complex issue and you don't want to find yourself, because you're frustrated on annual tax filing, shooting yourself in the foot on estate planning considerations or other considerations, or just frankly, visiting family in the United States in the future. So we covered a lot of issues. I want to point you to the Thun Financial website, thunfinancial.com. There's a lot of research on all those subjects. There's also webinars. And speaking of webinars, we are going to be having a couple of webinars on those very same subjects. David's going to be talking about the currency implications for Americans abroad. And then my colleagues, Kathleen and Jake, are going to be talking about U.S. retirement accounts for Americans abroad, which is one that we see a lot of people get incorrect. So strongly encourage you to join those. Thank you very much for participating today. We're now going to move into the question and answer session.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Peter, for that summary of the non-U.S. regulatory considerations that have resulted in this account closing crisis that we're talking about today. All right, we're now moving to questions, and we've got a lot of questions. So thank you for submitting them, and we will plan from this point forward to try to get through all of the questions. I'm going to scroll through here a bit and get past all the initial stuff until about, okay. All right, the first question I see coming from Andrew says, and I'm going to ask Peter to answer this one. Can you discuss any differences for dual citizens, e.g. UK, US?
Yeah, so this is an interesting one. I mean, in this case, he's talking about US, UK. It's my little, let's see, my Q&A scrolled way to the bottom. Oh, okay, I found it. Yeah, so in the context of what we work on, I mean, really, American US citizens or US taxpayers, because of citizenship-based taxation. So let's talk about the US citizen only. If you're a US passport holder, regardless of where you live, you have to take into consideration the US tax rules, plus the rules where you live, right? If you're a UK citizen, the rules of the UK apply to you, and from an income tax point of view, based on where you live. So if you're a dual US UK citizen residing in the UAE, for example, only have to worry about US issues and then UAE issues. If you're in the UK, whether you're a dual citizen or not, you're subject to the UK rules and the US rules. So if you're a US citizen in the UK, whether you're a US only or you're US UK, the same applies to you from an income tax point of view. And if you're in the UK, you will want to invest into dual reporting funds. And we have an article on that, the Catch-22, on our website under the research section.
Right, and we can open accounts for either US or UK citizens residing in the UK or the US, right? So your citizenship is not going to impede your ability to open accounts with us. All right, thank you. Going on, next question, I'll take this one. This one comes from Shuba, and Shuba writes, are the restrictions on account closure only for those residing in the EU? Great question, Shuba. Thank you for asking this one, because a lot of people see our presentation. We talk a lot about the EU, and they conclude that this is only a problem for clients in the EU. That is far from the case. Really, this is a problem globally. The big US financial institutions are restricting accounts for non-residents of the United States. That includes Japan, which is one of the most restricted countries, Singapore, which is even more restricted than Japan, and other jurisdictions across Asia, where generally, most of the U.S. financial institutions don't really distinguish between the EU and Asia in any sense. They are just not providing these services to anybody outside the United States. We talk a lot about the EU because for that small group of U.S. financial institutions that continue to operate and provide services for clients outside the United States, they then further restrict what they will do for the clients that they're still serving with respect to mutual funds and ETFs because of the MiFID II regulations. So the MiFID II regulations that we discussed and that Peter elaborated on, really, although it's EU-centric, it only is a further restriction for those who are able to get service to begin with, right? The problem still is most U.S. financial institutions will not even serve you in the EU or anywhere else outside the United States. So that's an important point to make, and thank you for bringing that up, Shuba. All right, let's see. Laurent writes, In a previous webinar, you indicated that HSBC was relatively safe to have a U.S. account at living if you're living in France. Has that now changed, or do you expect it to change, especially given the sale of HSBC France operation to private equity in the next couple of years, and the reduction of U.S. operations and focus on investment banking? I don't personally have any particular insight into what's happening within HSBC in respect to their service of Americans abroad. Peter, do you have any?
No, but reading that question, it almost feels like Laurent answered the question, right? HSBC seems to be narrowing the scope of its business, but yeah, I have no experience with HSBC that I could say one way or another.
I mean, we do know a lot of our clients use HSBC. They love this Premier account, which allows them to move money relatively seamlessly across currencies in different countries. It seems great. Yeah, they really extract a lot of fees, which is why we tell people there are probably better options. But it is a popular service. If it's going to be restricted in France now, we'll have to wait and see. All right. Edwin writes, and I think I'll take this one. Is a good strategy to use the address of a close relative in the USA as a legal address for a US citizen not physically resident in the USA? This is an important question, Edwin. I'm going to answer that. We need to be a little bit delicate in answering this one because some people have very, very strong views that this should not be done, right? I don't share those views. I believe that as Americans abroad, you have the right to use a U.S. address. You're in not violation of any law that I know of to be putting a U.S. address on an account, even if you happen to be residing outside the United States. All U.S. citizens are considered for tax purposes as domiciles of the U.S., which means they do have a permanent residence somewhere in the U.S., wherever that is. And now, that does not mean in any sense that a U.S. financial institution does not have the right to say, hey, if you reside outside the United States, we don't care if you have some legal address in the U.S. that you want to use. We're not going to service you. That's their right. They have the right to police this to their own requirements and what their own policies are, right? But the distinction is that Americans have are in violation of no law that I've ever heard of or rule that issued by the U.S. government that says you can't have a U.S. address on your financial account, because let's face it. I mean, many of us have old bank accounts and the mail is going to some address we lived at 10, 15, 30 years ago, reporting that we've got 35 cents in some bank account, right, that we forgot to close. And is that illegal? Are we breaking some law there? Does that make us taxable in that state? No, it doesn't. So I think that this is a legitimate approach for Americans abroad to use. But it is true that the financial institutions are policing this. They're looking up IP addresses, and if they see that you are logging in consistently from an address in France, they may very well, because we hear the story all the time, say, hey, you're using a U.S. address, but you appear to be living in France. And then they go ahead and close your account in any case, which they certainly have the right to do. So I think that that's the way to understand that important issue. All right, we're moving on now to Andre, and I'm going to ask Peter to answer this one. What are reporting obligations of the U.S. financial institutions vis-a-vis EU governments and EU financial institutions?
David, I was actually hoping you'd answer that, because I know in certain cases the U.S. has information sharing agreements with countries where there's an obligation to report on that country's citizens resident in the U.S. but or having accounts in the U.S. But I don't know to what extent that applies with the EU.
Right. Well, this falls under the general regulations of FATCA, right? And the ancillary agreements that were negotiated for the implementation of FATCA, called the Bilateral Agreements between the U.S. and all of the countries that signed on to FATCA. And what those agreements provide for is the U.S. came out with FATCA and said, hey, you foreign country, you foreign financial institution, we want to gather all of this data about any accounts that you have for U.S. citizens. And foreign countries came back and said, hey, well, we can't do that. That's going to be violating laws in our own country. So they negotiated these bilateral agreements to implement FATCA. And in those agreements, while the U.S. then it gets a legal way for them to collect this data on U.S. citizens with accounts outside the United States, the converse is the U.S. also agreed to provide the same data for U.S. financial accounts owned by residents of these other countries, of the other country involved, right? So a resident of Germany who has an account in the U.S. now has to assume that the U.S. is reporting on that account to the German government, right, for it to police tax and other regulatory requirements with respect to German law that covers those accounts owned by that resident of Germany. One important exception to this is that when the U.S. Issued regulations as to the implementation of these bilateral agreements, they said share the data, but not the data for U.S. citizens. So a U.S. citizen in Germany, a U.S. citizen in Singapore, a U.S. citizen in any other country outside the United States does not have to worry that the U.S. government is sharing data about their U.S. financial accounts with a foreign government. Because the U.S. didn't want to go down there because they thought that if they did that, it would be challenged successfully in the United States and made illegal. So I hope that sheds light on that for you, Andre. All right, let's move down now to Eleanor, who says, will these slides be available after the webinar? Yes, we are going to send a link so everyone can watch it on replay. All right, next question. Ethan writes, in regards to MiFID II restrictions for expats in the EU, now that the UK is no longer part of the EU, is there anything UK specific to keep in mind and any rumblings of future regulation that may be beneficial or restrictive? I think I'll take a stab at this one because I just had a very enlightening conversation with a compliance officer for a big financial institution in Switzerland a few days ago, and we were talking about the problem of Brexit and the implications for all of these EU regulations that the UK was heretofore a party to. And for the time being, the British regulators are continuing to comply with most of the EU financial regulations pending negotiation of new agreements about how this will continue in the future, given the fact that the UK is no longer part of the EU. So temporarily, things seem to be continuing as they were, and we know the U.S. banks continue to restrict the distribution of, for example, U.S. mutual funds and ETFs to residents of the UK because of the EU MiFID regulations. So the U.S. banks are continuing to abide by the EU regulations even for the UK, and that appears to be the way the EU financial institutions are operating. However, that may change because there is an expectation that there's going to be a new and general agreement on the provision of financial services between the UK and the EU coming forward, maybe this year or next. And so that's the status of that as best I understand it. And so I hope that answers. Peter, do you want to add anything to that important question?
No, that was good. That was good.
All right. So next one, Ashley writes, I'll let you answer this one, Peter. Are there tax haven accounts like Roths for expats?
I have a snarky response to that, but I can't think of any off the top of my head other than having a non-resident alien spouse in a low tax jurisdiction or a jurisdiction that doesn't tax investments. I'm thinking they're Middle East, Hong Kong, Singapore, maybe parts of Latin America, et cetera, where they're not facing taxation on those investments, transfer wealth to their name and buy non-U.S. investments. But you know, there's always tax in all the investments embedded. Roth IRAs are a pretty powerful type of account. They don't travel terribly well. They travel pretty well. That means not every foreign jurisdiction respects the Roth IRAs. Our colleagues, Kathleen and Jake, will talk more about that in the upcoming webinar. But there's nothing that jumps out at me. There's a lot of more IRA type of solutions, meaning foreign pensions and those types, whether at the individual level or the corporate level, that are recognized under tax treaty with the United States. But those are more deferred compensation arrangements. There are certain tax ways you can go about that, managing the tax between the foreign country and the U.S. to make it a tax efficient investment. So a bit of a long-winded response for you, Ashley, just trying to let you know that there's still hope and there's still solutions for you. Just because you can't necessarily or shouldn't invest into a Roth doesn't mean all hope is lost. There's some other avenues to consider. David?
Yeah, I would just add that, this idea of a tax haven, right? There really are no tax havens anymore for American citizens, right? Tax havens are places like, Bermuda or the Cayman Islands or Switzerland in the day, places where there was some expectation that you could put your money out of the reach of U.S. taxation. That's really gone. The U.S. has cracked open the whole global financial, all institutions in every country, and no country you will find is a place that's safe, a haven from U.S. taxation. So, hence, generally our advice is, don't try to seek those out because they will get you in trouble. All right, moving on. Ellie writes, are ETF accounts set up with Charles Schwab while still resident in the U.S. being closed after leaving to live abroad? We plan to set up accounts before we leave the U.S. to live in the U.K. for a couple of years. Thank you. All right, I'll jump in on that one. This is let's talk about Schwab specifically. We work with Schwab extensively, and there's one set of rules when you're working with our firm, and there's a different set of rules if you're working with Schwab directly. If you're working with Schwab directly, what you will find if you move to the UK is you're going to be able to maintain your accounts. They will not close them. They will allow you to put the UK address on them. However, you will no longer be able to buy or sell ETFs in those accounts, or mutual funds for that matter, because now you're in the EU, now you're restricted under MiFID, and even though you were able to maintain the account, you can't buy those products. You're going to be restricted, as Peter talked about in his presentation, to only individual stocks and bonds. Now, that's the UK. With all these institutions, there's a hodgepodge country by country of rules, and there are other countries in the EU where if you move to them, or in the world, not just the EU, that Schwab will close your account if they find that you're moving there, such as Italy, France, Singapore, and so on and so forth. So again, it's country by country, issue by issue on all of these matters. All right, next question. All right, Peter, I'll let you answer this one. How much does Thun charge when they manage an Expat Fidelity account? Say the account has 100,000 or 250,000. Please give us a general idea of the costs.
Absolutely. Thank you for the question, Albert. So we're compensated on the basis of assets under management, and that's the only way we receive compensation. So a lot of the work we do involves financial planning analysis, of course, as I talked about, and even connecting our clients with other professionals that are relevant for them. If you're a resident in a particular country and you need to execute an estate plan, we recognize where our limitations are, and we'll get you in touch with a good service provider there. And we do not receive compensation for that. We also don't get compensation for whether we're using Vanguard ETFs or iShares or dimensional fund, mutual funds, et cetera, whatever sort of investments we're making for clients in the US and outside the US, we don't receive compensation for. Our only fee comes in the form of our management fee, and that is 1.2% per year on the amount of assets under management up to the first 500,000. And as I said, it's tiered, so then it falls to 1% on the next 1.5 million, then it falls again thereafter to 0.85%, and then it falls again and again and again, and keeps declining as assets with us increase.
All right, great. All right, Meg writes, E-Trade brokerage account is not good to have if I become a non-U.S. resident. If so, why? Why Schwab and Fidelity are better for expats? I have Schwab, Fidelity, and E-Trade, and I want to consolidate to one or two as a non-resident. I'm a green card holder and have been away. I have been away from the U.S. for 1.5 years, planning to live in Australia or Japan. All right, let me take a stab at this one, Meg. So E-Trade, I personally have had accounts at E-Trade for many, many years. A couple of years ago, I went and spent a year in Germany. I had no problem maintaining my E-Trade account. They do have a policy, as I understand it, of not allowing you to change your address to a foreign address. I just kept my U.S. address as I was gone, somewhat temporarily, and that seemed to work fine. And they didn't, start seeing that I was logging in every day from outside the United States. So that did not seem to be a problem to just continuing to use a U.S. address. I don't know if it's still that way at E-Trade. I do know that we get a lot of people calling up here saying E-Trade said I can't use a non-U.S. address and they don't feel comfortable using a U.S. address, so they come to us. But I do think that you can continue to use that U.S. address and you'll get away with it. Now, you're asking about Schwab and Fidelity, and you're saying, why are Schwab and Fidelity better for expats? Well, let's be clear about this. They may or they may not be, right? Depends. Working with us, they're good, right? We can open a Schwab or Fidelity accounts for anybody in almost any country in the world, okay? If you're doing it yourself, though, Schwab is pretty good. Some countries it works, some countries it doesn't. Fidelity doesn't work at all, right? Fidelity will not maintain accounts for people outside the United States if the accounts are held directly, right? So those, you need to be aware of that. I think in some cases Fidelity may allow you to maintain an account while you move abroad if you had it established, but you cannot call up from most places in the world and say, hey, I live in Spain, I want to open an account at Fidelity on your own. They won't allow it. So again, it's a hodgepodge. It depends whether or not you're working directly with these institutions or by working with us. But I think if you've got accounts at E-Trade and you've got a U.S. address and you're only going abroad for a year and a half, I would just leave that U.S. address on it, and I think you're going to be fine.
Yeah, I just on that, David, I find Schwab to be pretty global as a company.
Yes.
They have foreign phone numbers for customer service, et cetera. So of those three choices, if I was working with them directly, if I had to pick one directly, I would go with Schwab. But if you already have all three, I mean, I guess you keep them.
Exactly. Okay, and next question, Peter, why don't you answer this one following right on from that. Does Interactive Brokers fall into the same camp as Schwab and Fidelity? What about Interactive Brokers?
I mean, Interactive Brokers generally was considered, pretty more relaxed, but in our experience, Interactive Brokers was in some ways more restrictive than Schwab. And recently I've heard that Interactive Brokers is clamping down on certain account types outside the United States as well. So if you're an Interactive Brokers client, certain countries, Japan, for example, you would have to open an Interactive Brokers Japan account. You wouldn't be able to get an Interactive Brokers US account. Same if you're in Hong Kong, get a Hong Kong account. But then other jurisdictions, you can get a US account and get access to all the right types of investments. Interactive Brokers has a very prosumer platform. It's kind of hard to manipulate, not a lot of phone help there, so be mindful of that, the experience you might have if you're not sort of really wanting to dig in and go up that learning curve of how to manipulate their software. You might find it quite frustrating, but pros and cons, understanding the nuances of all these firms, but Interactive Brokers is no panacea in and of itself. As I'm saying, each of these firms has their own unique, some are better in some areas, some are better than areas, some allow some countries, some allow other countries. So you just got to know, Andrew, it depends where you're headed, and maybe we can give you some more insights specific to your situation if you give us a call.
All right, great. Meg writes, I only have savings and checking accounts with Wells Fargo, not a brokerage account. I cannot keep my bank account because I'm living abroad now. I'm a U.S. green card holder away from the U.S. for 1.5 years. My understanding is, yes, Wells Fargo is closing not only investment accounts, but bank accounts for non-U.S. residents as well. Meg. So I think you're going to have to find a place to move your accounts if they're at Wells Fargo and you don't want to just keep using a U.S. address. And I think Wells Fargo, we hear, is cracking down on that too pretty aggressively, people trying to use a U.S. address while they're outside the United States. So I would look for alternatives. Colin writes, in terms of brokerage companies, what is your opinion of interactive brokers? Okay, Peter just answered that one, Colin. So let's move on to the next question here. Laurent writes, can you please provide a list of U.S. banks that are safe for Americans in France, and even better, that also have branches in France to facilitate banking overseas? Peter, you're in France, you've got to get banking services. I'm not sure if we're talking about investment services here or just banking services. In case, what are you going to do?
I don't know. When I was abroad, I used Citibank. Citibank and HSBC tend to be two of the more global banks with branches around the world. I don't know to what extent Citibank is on the ground in France. I'm not sure for American in the U.S. bank, American in France. I mean, that's a tough one. I couldn't say definitively. My suspicion is you'll have to have two solutions, right? If you want to maintain a U.S. bank account, you'll have a U.S. bank account, maybe at a credit union or local U.S. bank, and then you'll have a separate French bank account, BNP Paribas or something like that, whatever works for you in that local area. I mean, a lot of our clients are dealing with the most attractive local solution. We can provide cash solutions for clients through the brokerage avenue. So clients who've had U.S. bank accounts find they kind of go dormant when working with us, but they maintain those U.S. accounts, and it's a wide spectrum. Like I said, some are local credit unions all the way up to some national banks, just depending on what the clients had in place. But those aren't widely used by our clientele. They're generally using their local banks for their day-to-day.
Yeah, exactly. All right, thank you. Let's move on then to Sandra, who writes, thank you for such a valuable and informative service you are providing for the expat community abroad. You're welcome, Sandra. I do have a question regarding PFICs. How does an expat know if a potential investment is considered a PFIC? All right, that's a great question, Sandra. It's really pretty simple, right? A PFIC is a passive foreign investment company. Okay, passive means it invests in things like stocks and bonds, right? It's investing, and the two critical rules is that more than 75% of the assets are, I'm sorry, I can't even remember the two rules, Peter, but it's basically the income is being
75% of its gross income, right? An average percent of assets
are non-U.S., right? So what does this mean? It means that any kind of non-U.S. registered fund, right, is going to be a foreign investment company. And then if its income is passive, right, if it's investing in, it's getting dividend and interest income, even if it's a U.S., I should correct myself, even if that income is U.S. sourced, right, it doesn't matter. It's the fact that the income is coming from investments makes it passive, and the structure is foreign, it's registered outside the United States, that makes it a passive foreign investment company. So the shorthand is, this means any kind of a mutual fund registered outside the United States. So any kind of mutual fund you might find a local bank in the UK or Italy or Japan distributing to its clients. For US tax purposes, if you're a US taxpayer, you have to report that as a PFIC, right? It does not mean that the investments in the fund are necessarily foreign. They could be US, right? For example, but that doesn't really matter. What matters is where is the fund registered. And it's not just funds. It can include things like insurance policies, things that you don't think of as investments, such as as funds, such as annuities, and so on and so forth. So be very careful with respect to any kind of investment product broadly thought of that is not registered in the U.S. Most of them will be PFICs. All right.
I'll just add to that. It's juxtapose that against an operating company. right? A business, that's a different story. So you could buy shares of a business without an issue, but you're buying shares of an entity whose sole purpose is to receive passive income. And the real issue that Uncle Sam has with PFICs is they don't necessarily report the income at the shareholder level to him. So he loses transparency on your income. So because it's opaque, he just assumes, okay, I'm going to tax you heavily on that investment because I don't know exactly what share of that income you received. If you notice in the United States, anytime you own a mutual fund or an ETF, you get dividends paid to you, a fractional dividend, which is your pro rata share of the income of the fund. And maybe you even get annual capital gains distributions because that's your pro rata fractional share of the income of the fund. So that's totally transparent and passed through. Uncle Sam accepts that, and he can tax each person at their own unique level. These foreign entities, they don't provide that transparency to him. So punitive taxation.
Okay, let's see. Tyler writes, in one of your videos from last year on this subject, you speak of one time where Schwab, as very first case, has looked up an IP address. The very first case has looked up an IP address of a client and asked them to change their address. Could you elaborate on this further? Thank you. Yeah, I think, Peter, we did hear of a case where somebody had reported to us that Schwab literally had said, we see you logging on, and we were surprised. We see you logging on from outside the United States. Where are you actually residing? And we had never heard such a report from Schwab. We had heard that report from a lot of institutions, including Fidelity, but never from Schwab. Do you recall that, Peter? You want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, that was quite a while ago, but I don't recall that being our client. That was a situation of somebody who called in and reported that to us. So I think you touched on the issue a few moments ago when you said, hey, our experience in dealing with the brokerage firms is very different. So the clients who work with us, they have a very different experience than the clients who work directly, or non-clients, I guess, in that case, working directly with the brokerage firms. And there's a different expectation, right? Because we're partnering with the brokerage firms to meet the regulatory requirements that we already talked about, all the different rules, et cetera. But when the brokerage firm owns the entire relationship, they take on the burden of all those aspects. So the case in point is Fidelity. Through us, we can get accounts at Fidelity in a lot of places, but directly contacting Fidelity outside the United States, we hear of very limited scope.
Right, and yes, Fidelity is known quite aggressively to look up IP addresses. I think that one report about Schwab, though, is the only case we've ever heard of. Maybe there's more, yeah. But it seemed that Schwab does that very much.
I vaguely recall it was like a phone call that we got right before the webinar, so it's kind of top of mind.
All right, Kendra writes, assuming we appropriately report investment accounts and income from those accounts as part of our tax return, are there any potential consequences to us as account holders if we recently located outside the U.S. and do not inform financial institutions of our change of address? The answer to this, Kendra, the simple answer is no. There are no consequences. Well, I mean, the one consequence is if they find out that you've moved abroad, they may close your account. Right? They may freeze your account. But that's it, right? You're not committing some illegal act here. They're not going to call the police and seize your assets or report you to the Treasury Department or the tax authorities in other countries. You're fine. Don't worry about it. I hope that financial institution will allow you to get away with that for as long as possible because they probably don't want you to be living abroad and using a U.S. address. But as long as it works, it works. All right. Albert writes, is there a strong lobby working on our side to help overcome some of these overbearing regulations? Most of us overseas are normal law-abiding citizens who are trying to make ends meet. We are not out to break laws and perform money laundering. Is the only solution to lose U.S. citizenship? Yeah, that's a great question, Albert. Somebody asked it on all these webinars, and thankfully so, because it gives us a moment to just talk a little bit about the politics of all of this. As far as who's lobbying this, okay, the biggest lobby against this, the biggest organization lobbying against this is the ACA, the American Citizens Abroad. They're headquartered in Geneva, Switzerland, and Washington, D.C., and they have a very dedicated group that we've worked with closely over the years, that I've been involved with myself quite extensively over the years, and they are constantly up on Capitol Hill trying to talk to congressmen and senators and inform them about the absolutely undue burden that U.S. citizenship-based taxation, that FATCA and all these other regulations impose on, as you say, law-abiding Americans who are just trying to make ends meet, right? Unfortunately, they've been doing it for a long time and they've gotten nowhere, right? The only real time when I thought that we were close to getting some real reform of citizenship-based taxation, for example, or FATCA, was in the early years of the Trump administration, when there were several congressmen who wanted to get reform of this system in the big Trump tax reform or tax cuts of that era. In the final days, they took the language out of the bill, and that just tells you even the Republicans didn't want to do it, and the Democrats are, there are many important Democratic voices who are talking about increasing FATCA and strengthening FATCA, right? So they don't get it. They don't get that this is not fair. It doesn't register to them how this actually plays out for people like you. They think they're just going after rich guys trying to hide their money in Switzerland. We all know on this call that that's not what it's about, but it's very hard, unfortunately, to explain that to the politicians or to the public in the U.S. So I don't have a real great outlook for you that it's going to change anytime soon.
But also, David, can I just highlight too, even if we get past that American citizenship-based taxation, we still have foreign regulations to deal with, right? We still have common reporting standards. We still have the MiFID II, which we like to talk a lot about because it covers a huge part of the globe, being Europe. So those rules, Albert, I'm afraid, those aren't controlled by the U.S. So what David talked about is the lobbying happening with Congress and laws affecting citizenship-based taxation. But it's not obvious to me that if they did away with that you anyhow, then what you would do is you just point your investments in a different direction, right? Maybe you wouldn't be so keen to get US investments, but did you want a US brokerage account? Maybe the brokerage firms still don't welcome you because they're worried about the EU regulations, right? So it's a lot of issues to overcome. As I said before, I feel that we've successfully navigated these issues for our clientele and provided them an avenue to invest tax efficiently and painlessly. But if you're trying to deal with this directly, as a former expat myself, I know it's very hard.
Right, really important point you made there, Peter. It's not just about FATCA and US regulation. All right, Lynn writes, please clarify, I thought if we live abroad, we should not invest in mutual funds unless they are registered in the US. Now right. You are saying foreign address equals no US mutual fund. Okay, so sorry for the confusion on this, Lynn. Let me clarify. What we're saying is, from a tax perspective, as a US taxpayer, you need to own US investment products because the foreign mutual fund is going to blow you up on your US taxes. The conundrum is, however, that if you're in the EU, right, all the firms in the US that might still maintain your account, such as say Schwab will open your account, maintain your account if you're in Germany, but they will not allow you to invest in that mutual fund. They will not allow you to invest in that US ETF because of the MiFID regulations. So this, they're getting you from all sides here. So yes, we say on our slide that, no foreign address means no U.S. mutual funds. That's correct. And mutual funds are further restricted, right? That's not even a MiFID regulation. That's a U.S. regulation. No U.S. Mutual funds for distribution outside the United States. ETFs presumably are not as restricted, and they should be available for distribution, and they generally are. We can buy a U.S. ETF for a client in, say, Switzerland, right, which is not EU, and no problem, and they can even buy it themselves with a Schwab account from Switzerland. But if you're in the EU, you can't you can't buy that U.S. mutual fund or that U.S. ETF. Well, you can't buy that U.S. ETF because of the MiFID II regulations. So in the EU now, especially, they're getting it coming and going, right? The U.S. has its rules, and then what's left over, then the EU gets you. We do have the solution working with us. We can continue to buy those U.S. ETFs for you, even if you're in the EU, because of the exception to the EU rules that Peter highlighted in his presentation.
Yeah. Even our clients who have foreign addresses, let's say a client in Australia, not subject to EU regulation, we also cannot buy U.S. mutual funds in their account. So that header was the title of that slide was more of a statement of fact. If you happen to have a foreign address, you will no longer have access to U.S. mutual funds. It was not you should not buy U.S. mutual funds. It was you will not be able to buy. And I apologize for the ambiguity there. Absolutely, if you're a U.S. taxpayer, do not buy foreign mutual funds in a standard brokerage account.
But ETFs, which are similar to mutual funds, nevertheless have a different set of regulations, and they are generally available, except in the. All right, I know it's very confusing, right? And it takes a long time to sort all this stuff out. All right, Michael writes, this situation is a travesty for Americans abroad, including all ambassadors, military, and other personnel, including volunteers such as Doctors Without Borders. Why isn't the focus on citizenship? Why isn't the focus on citizenship instead of residence? Seems like someone needs to start a ground roots efforts to lobby Congress about this disruptive nonsense. Why isn't the focus on citizenship? Well, for Americans, right, the focus is on citizenship. That's what makes it such a big problem for Americans. You are taxable in the U.S. on your citizenship, even though you live outside of the United States. That's where all the complexity comes from, specifically for Americans, Michael. I mean, yes, there's the other issues as well, but it's the citizenship issue that is the problem for Americans, and it's important to understand how that works and how that forces different financial institutions to treat Americans differently. All right, next one.
Michael, the question makes me feel like the next question would be about expatriation, because it's so frustrating. My wife's not American. She's constantly asking me that question if we lived abroad. Why is it fair that you would live overseas and have to pay U.S. taxes?
Yes.
I don't know how to answer the question. I don't make the rules. I follow them.
All right. Will this presentation be recorded view later? Yes, it will. You will get a link after this webinar that will allow you to watch the replay, and feel free to share it with anyone who you think is interested in watching it as well. Next question, that was from Edwin. Next question from Sabine. Hello, can a U.S. expat in Costa Rica trade ETFs? Costa Rica is pretty open at Schwab, probably not at Fidelity, but generally if you can get an account open, or if you have an account open and you're in Costa Rica, you will be able to trade ETFs. Sabine. All right, next question from Jeffrey. Will my VPN help hide my IP address? Peter?
Yep, should. I mean, that's the point. If it doesn't, you better get a new VPN. Let's say that.
Yep. Yes, and Ellen writes, yes, it will be recorded, Ellen. All right, Robert writes, I'm a resident of Switzerland. Does Switzerland comply with MiFID II, PRIPS, and KIDS?
Well, it shouldn't, but David, do you know?
Yeah, no, Switzerland does not. Switzerland does not.
But I mean, the brokerage firms is what I wanted to ask you. Are they good enough to separate Switzerland out?
Yes, I mean, Schwab does, absolutely. And so those rules do not apply for our clients in Switzerland. And I would imagine most firms that will still maintain an account for you in Switzerland will recognize that Switzerland is not in the EU.
Yeah, I mean, the reason why I was asking David that question is because sometimes, you know, the letter and then the implementation don't always line up perfectly because of different brokerage policies, et cetera. So That's again what we were talking about before about understanding the nuances of each of the firms and how they operate and which firm is going to be the right solution, which is the first question that we resolve for clients when they come to us. Where are you located? Where are you headed? What type of investments are appropriate for you? Okay, let's now decide what the right service provider will be for you. And fortunately, we have a list of choices to pick from.
All right. Tim writes, I'm a U.S. citizen living in the UK. I opened a Schwab One international account specifically because I believed I could purchase dual reporting ETFs. I knew mutual funds I knew that mutual funds were off limits, but I discovered ETFs were restricted as well due to having a legal residence in the EU, precisely. Do you anticipate these rules changing in the near future due to Brexit? I think I heard the UK was implementing similar rules to the EU in this regard. Tim, we really answered this question, so I'm not going to answer it again. Go back and listen to the earlier question. But yes, what you've described here is precisely the problem. You can't get an account opened at Schwab if you're in the UK, but you will not be able to buy ETFs. And will that change? We don't know. All right, Ashley writes, does married filing separately have to put investments of the spouse, or does the non-American spouse stay completely off of the American tax return? Peter?
Yeah, it should not. Married filing separately. I think you put the name on there of your spouse, but I think beyond that, that's it. I mean, the whole idea is you don't report your non-tax paying spouse's information to Uncle Sam.
Right. All right. Kevin writes, I have dual citizenship, US and UK, resident in the UK, paying UK taxes while I file in both jurisdictions. Are you advising that I should be buying UK investment? I shouldn't be buying UK investment products?
Yeah, it depends the account type, right?
AJ Bell, for example. I'm not sure what AJ Bell is. Do you know what that is, Peter?
I don't. Is AJ Bell a security or a company?
Yeah. Well, Kevin, what you can say is you should not be buying UK mutual funds or UK unit trusts or UK annuities. These kinds of things are going to create big US tax problems for you, right? So if you have a UK pension, don't worry about it. The pension wrapper is what matters for taxation, not the underlying investments. So owning a UK mutual fund within your UK employer-sponsored pension scheme, not a problem, right? But in anything outside of a UK pension, a UK mutual fund or a UK annuity or anything like that is a US tax problem. It's not illegal, right? You're not breaking the law. You can own these things. You're simply going to get taxed very punitively in the US, and you can have a very complex tax return to report these things.
AJ Bell is a broker / fund provider. So yeah, I would say avoid AJ Bell's funds in exactly with the way David described. And note, ISAs, I see AJ Bell offers ISAs. Those are not protected by the tax treaty. So any investments held in the ISA are going to be fully subject to US taxation. So if you have a UK fund in an ISA, you now have a PFIC problem, the passive foreign investment company problem. So in an ISA, own individual stocks and shares.
All right. Okay. Wow, we got a lot of questions to go through, so we're going to try to start speeding it up. All right. Susan writes, I'm a US and EU dual citizen. I invested in US mutual funds, IRAs, and a 401k and bond funds about 25 years ago and have held them ever since. Do I need to give them up? Are they in danger of being taken away? I am part owner of a house in California, but am actually resident in the EU, and all my investments use my EU address. Shall I switch the address to the California address, even if I don't actually live there? You know, Susan, you probably don't have much to worry about. No one is going to you know, you ask here, are your investments going to be taken away? No one's going to take away your investments. Where we see financial institutions finding out that their clients are actually in the EU when they've been using a US address, what do? They can force you to close your account and move your investments someplace else. They may perhaps just freeze your account and say, hey, you know, you're frozen, right? We're not selling anything, but you can't buy or sell anything more. That's also common. I think Fidelity does that in a lot of cases. But you're not gonna find that anyone is just taking your investments away. We have heard of cases where after multiple notices to move assets out because a financial institution is going to close the account, they do sometimes sell the investments and send people a check in the mail. So that could be getting as close as to what you described that we've ever heard of. Now, you said that are you better off changing your address on those accounts to California? You could do that. I don't think that's an unreasonable strategy. It could avoid problems in the future. On the other hand, if your financial institution has not notified you yet, they're probably not recognizing that you're in the EU, and they probably never will. It's still generally hard for them to detect it if they're not scrutinizing very, very closely. As far as your house in the U.S., okay, that's yeah. So I hope that answers that question, Susan.
Yeah, David, just a couple things. I mean, Wells Fargo. Yesterday, I spoke to somebody who has an account or had an account at Merrill Edge. Merrill Edge, actually, it was an IRA. They distributed a check to the individual saying, hey, you got to get out. You didn't meet the window of 30 days to get out, and here's your money. See you later. And Wells Fargo threatened to do the same to me. Actually, they wouldn't even let me liquidate or transfer my account. They said if I don't reach out to them, they'll just give my money to Uncle Sam. So each firm has their own rules. As David talked about for Susan, I don't feel nervous about that, but I just want to mention, you know, it really depends on where your assets are held and also which country you're in.
Right. All right. Peter Noga writes, what if the life insurance policy is offered with employment package?
That's great. No problem. Chances are it's a term life policy. We don't like investment connected. Those are not favorable. But if you have a term life policy, and if it's part of your employment package, I don't feel concerned at all.
All right, Jeffrey writes, in my experience, it isn't just U.S. address, but also one needs to maintain a U.S. phone number.
Good point. Good.
Yep, absolutely true.
Yep. Google phone, Skype, those work. Good point, Jeffrey.
All right, Dara writes, can a U.S. address of a rental property I own be used even if I don't live there, i.e. I'm a foreign resident? Or is a U.S. PO box a better approach? No, that residential address, Dara, is your best option. Most institutions, we know certainly Schwab and Fidelity and Pershing will not allow a PO box.
Yeah, there's like two layers of addresses. There's the residential and then the mailing. PO boxes will work for that mailing address, but if you want to register your account, you need an actual residential address. Don't put a 10-story office building.
All right, Albert writes, you say they are looking out for financial interests for both ends, kids and SEC regulations. What is actually happening is that these regulations are actually suffocating attempts to prosper while overseas. What a shameful way of treating your citizens. No disagreement here on that.
Yeah,
I don't.
That's right, Albert. Yeah, this is we fall through the cracks.
All right, Yvonne writes, how are foreign employer retirement investment accounts impacted with these regulations causing account closures?
Yeah, they're foreign accounts.
Yep, great question, and really depends upon the country and the treaty and the bank's institutions, regulations for that country and so on and so forth. Peter, you want to attempt an answer to that?
No, I mean, we don't really see issues around that. I mean, once in a while, I see in certain jurisdictions clients who have a third country pension that their employer set up for them, which is effectively just like a brokerage account. Oftentimes, the plan wrapper shields the individual participant from a lot of these account closure issues, et cetera, because the client of the firm holding the assets is not you, the individual, it's the actual company. So it doesn't give me concern. What we focus more on in those situations is the taxation of that account and whether or not it's a recognized scheme by treaty. Are you going to get tax deferral? Are you going to be taxed on it? Do you have a PFIC issue? I have a foreign pension. I have PFIC issues in that account, right? So I got to be careful what I invest in that account. But a lot of our clients have pension, corporate pension plans abroad, outside the United States, no problem. Uncle Sam recognizes those per the treaty.
Right, sure. Correct. All right, Hannah writes, what about foreign residential properties abroad? Planning on retiring in Spain, now residing in Germany, should I move all money I have to the in the US to a European bank account? So if you're talking about cash, right, generally we would recommend that Americans hold their cash, or EU residents hold their cash in a European bank account in euros. If we're talking about investment accounts, Hannah, as a US citizen, whether you're resident in Germany or resident in France, you want to hold those through US institutions, because that's the only place you're going to have a chance to get the investment products that are going to be suitable from a tax perspective. Now, I know that's the problem, right? Well, now I can't get the account open, so we're giving you these tools. Use a US address, work with us, or if absolutely necessary, yes, have your investments in a EU institution, but then only buy individual stocks or bonds. And this goes back to the 3 bullet points from one of Peter's slides that he presented, where he talks through each of those. So go back and look at that. All right. Dove writes, what happens when your retirement accounts get closed? For example, with a 401k or IRA, is it treated like a distribution and taxed as such, Peter?
Yes. Yeah, so that's the particular pain of that situation, is if you're not of the right age, you could even face penalties. I'll just pick on that poor individual yesterday that I spoke with who had an account at Merrill. The money got distributed and taxes got withheld. So then if you want to get that money put through an indirect rollover into a new IRA to avoid, paying a early withdrawal penalty, you not only have to get the money that you received from the brokerage firm into a new IRA, but you also have to add back the tax that was withheld. So that means you got to have some cash on your hand to top that up. So the short answer to Dove's question is yes.
Right. Rudy writes, why is there such a focus on PFIX? We have a big focus on that because I would say that is the single most common high consequence investment mistake made by Americans abroad. Rudy, simple as that, right? Where people end up getting into big tax problems, the most common scenario is they've been living abroad, they started buying mutual funds in their country of residence, and lo and behold, 5, 10, 20 years later, they realized that these things were actually PFIX all along, and they weren't reported properly all of these years, which takes a bad problem and compounds it by many, many multiples when it's gone on for a long time. So that's why we talk a lot about it. All right, Thomas writes, is it possible to use a relative's address in the US to open and maintain a brokerage account? Yes, I think we've addressed that one, Thomas. Kim writes, I still have a private Wells Fargo account in the USA. Should I move it, or does this just apply to business accounts? No, it doesn't just apply to business accounts, Kim. I think if you have a Wells Fargo account and the question is, are you using a US address on it, in which case they may never know that you're outside the United States. They may never ask you to close it. But if you have a non-US address, you should be getting notified by Wells Fargo now that you need to close that account. Dove writes, since Thun has a minimum asset amount, are there other firms that you can recommend for smaller investors? Good question, Dove. Since we have joined with Creative Planning, it's important to note that we now take individuals with as little as 100,000. It used to be 500,000, so that's part of the answer. The minimums at almost all other institutions that I know are even higher than $500,000. So I don't really have a really good answer for that. Really, for people with less than $100,000, the best solution is to try to do it yourself through an institution like Schwab. All right, Phoebe writes, is it legal to use a family member's U.S. address on a U.S. bank account? Yes, we've answered that one, Phoebe. Phoebe, hope you heard that earlier. Claire writes, if I change my U.S. address back, my address back to the U.S. address, would Fidelity lift the restrictions on my ability to trade, buy ETF stocks and mutual funds? Yes, I believe the answer is yes. they will. And we have seen people do this, and that works as long as Fidelity is not in any way aware that you actually do remain outside the United States, in which case they won't allow it. All right, Anne writes, if using a U.S. address on my brokerage accounts, is there a risk to me at some point that the firm will kick me out? As a young American in the EU, my solution seems pretty limited and I don't yet meet the minimum to work with a firm like yours. Yes, Anne, we've answered that question several times now, so I hope you've got the answer in hand. All right, Jerome writes, will using a VPN to log on to a stateside account avoid the issue of the foreign IP address? Yes, I mean, that can be to mask your IP, certainly. Philip writes, is using a US mailing forwarding service an easy solution to keep a US address? Any risks with this approach? Peter, yeah, what about these mail forwardings?
Yeah, it depends on the company, and again, I mentioned before the 2 levels of registration on the account. If you're using that as your main registration, well, we have received pushback from the brokerage firms when that is an office location and not a residential address. So that really depends. And as a matter of convenience, having that as your mailing address can be quite convenient. A lot of our clients use that. They get scanned copies of the mail, et cetera, and they find it very functional and takes some of the burden off of anybody else that would be receiving mail on their behest. But that, in my view, is the quote unquote risk, and I think those are some of the benefits of using that service.
All right. Shirley writes, I'm a Wells Fargo customer for 30 years. I have a checking in both personal and business account savings. Are you saying that I should move to another institution? I am moving to Italy. Shirley Jones. Shirley. Yes, Shirley, yes, unless you intend to not let Wells Fargo know that you have moved to Italy, you will need to change institutions, because if you tell them you're moving to Italy, they will force you out. All right, Rosemary writes, is buying and owning real estate property considered an offshore investment? Property that is principal residence and property that is income earning, what taxes should we be aware of? Well, real estate outside the United States is, from the US perspective, a foreign investment, but it's not a particularly complex one for US tax reporting purposes. It doesn't have the complexity, say, for example, of a foreign mutual fund, right, or a foreign insurance policy. So having an investment property outside the United States, not particularly complex, has some currency reporting issues, but I don't think you're going to have a big problem there. The income that you're generating from outside the US is, of course, taxable in the US, because as an American citizen, you are taxable on your worldwide income, and that includes any income generated from an investment property outside the US.
What if she sets up a company to buy the real estate?
Well, good question. Now, of course, you may have a more complex scenario because you've created a structure, a foreign corporation potentially, and foreign corporations have more complex reporting.
Yeah, direct investment, pretty straightforward. Indirect investment, you start running into complexities. So tread carefully, Rosemary.
Yes, good caveat there, Peter. All right, Eve writes, good morning. Does a foreign deposit savings account have to be reported differently than a foreign money market account? Just interest, no investment vehicles? Peter?
Well, what account is that? There's no interest anywhere in the world, but yes, interest is just interest income, and you report it as income on your US tax return, right? So I don't think there's anything necessarily different there. A foreign money market account, I guess I would just be a little bit concerned about that being rolled into a foreign money market fund. We want to avoid funds, but interest received on a bank account is just interest.
Yeah. So foreign money market funds, right? If they're not registered in the U.S. and they're funds, because money market investments are often structured as funds, yeah, that could be a PFIC. All right. Daisy writes, I moved abroad in 2011 and have no immediate plan to return. I have continued to maintain my pre-existing US bank accounts with my parents' home address and even recently opened a new account with that same address. Is there any risk of being accused of fraud or something like that? Okay, Daisy, I think we've answered that one, so hopefully you've got that answer in hand. Sabine writes, with FATCA, does France have access to IRS tax reporting? Good question. We kind of answered this more generally, but specific to France. France does have a agreement with the United States for the implementation of FATCA in France, and that does give France the right to receive information from the U.S. regarding U.S. financial institutions accounts held for residents of France, except for U.S. citizens who are residents of France. The U.S. government is unilaterally withholding that and not sharing that. So I hope that answers that question, Sabine. All right. Kristen writes, I'm looking to relocate to Costa Rica on a pensionado, a pensioner visa. They require $60,000 in their bank. Should I be looking at keeping most of my cash in the new country's account, should I keep most of my cash in the new country's account given this account closing crisis?
I don't feel motivated there. David, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, I would meet their requirements to get your visa. Beyond that, you're probably going to be successful in maintaining a U.S. bank account for holding cash while you're in Costa Rica. So I wouldn't worry about it. The first thing, because again, remember, bank accounts are a lot easier to maintain than investment accounts. The first thing to do is just call up your financial institution and say, hey, if I move to Costa Rica and I change my address to Costa Rica, are you going to kick me out? They'll tell you, right? You're gonna find plenty of institutions that will say, no, that's fine, don't worry about it, for a bank account. Investment accounts are a different story.
Yeah, that's what I did. I changed my bank account at Wells Fargo, which then updated the investment account, which then gave me a headache, which then I called you.
So, all right, Robert writes, is moving my investment portfolio with Schwab away from a domestic account into their international accounts? Is moving my, okay, is it a good idea? I think maybe Robert means to say. Well, if at Schwab, if you change your address to a non-U.S. address, you go from a Schwab One account to a Schwab One international account, right? And then Schwab One international accounts have some restrictions. It depends upon where you are. So if you're gonna change that address, be aware that you're gonna now have an international account. International accounts have restrictions based upon the country in which you reside. All right, Chris writes, if one has an APO, Army Post Office address, does that count as a permanent U.S. address and therefore exempt from this account closure environment? Good question. Peter, you want to try that one?
I don't have any direct experience with that, so I dare not say. I would say no, that my logic would say no, but I would need to confirm that and get back to Chris.
Yeah, I think people are using these military addresses for U.S. servicemen abroad, and it's often with diplomats abroad and so forth as well. And they seem to work; they don't get closed. So I think you're okay there. Omar writes, if your bank decides to close your account because you live in Europe or China, do they inform you first, or do they just shut your account and then you have to reach your account, to transfer your account elsewhere later? Good question, Omar. From what all I hear is, virtually everyone gets notified. We have heard of horrible cases where, the bank had my mailing address for somebody that I was using somewhere else, and I never got the mail, right? So I only find out now that they've sent 4 letters to me over 3 months, and I never got any of them. And then they did just close my account, sell all the investments, and send me a check, right? So that can happen, to be very careful. All right, Anthony writes, there's a real chance that residency-based taxation may be passed in the near future by Congress. How will this affect the investment situation of Americans abroad, especially in the EU? All right, Anthony, well, if the US gets rid of citizenship-based taxation, which is what I think you're saying in saying that there's a chance for residency-based taxation, yeah, it's gonna change a lot. It won't change everything, right? A lot of these restrictions to in one form or another come back to the fact that Americans continue to be U.S. taxable even when they reside outside the United States. But some of the restrictions have nothing to do with the U.S. regulatory environment or the U.S. tax environment, right? That's the point that Peter was making with respect to MiFID II. And so that could have a big impact. It might not get rid of it completely. What it would do is for an American citizen abroad, right, which will go a long way to solve the problems, is it would allow you not to merely maintain investment accounts in the U.S. Right now, you pretty much, for tax efficiency purposes, want to maintain U.S. investment accounts. But if we didn't have that citizenship-based taxation, then the possibility of using standard EU-based investment solutions would be much more open, and that would make it a lot easier. All right. Fabian writes, thank you for this insightful discussion. You mentioned IP tracking when logging into US accounts. Is this a real problem you've seen before? Would you recommend using a VPN to log into your US accounts, Peter?
Yes. I mean, I would, if you wanna, depends what country you're in, really. I think it just reduces the risk. And IP tracking is really firm specific as well. That's where our experience is. Schwab has been more lenient in that regard, and then other firms are much more aggressive about paying attention to the IP or even your caller ID or things like that. So if you want to just, take one more risk off the table, use a VPN.
Right, I agree. All right, Brad writes, or Katie writes, why is having a US resident address only a temporary solution? Okay, good question. Well, I think it's very legitimate, especially legitimate if you're only going abroad temporarily, to just not change all the addresses to your foreign address on your investment accounts. If you go abroad permanently, however, right, a lot of financial institutions will say, in fact, I know Schwab will say this, if you're moving abroad for less than a year, you can maintain an address. That's our formal policy. But if you stay for more than a year, you have to tell us and you have to start using your local address. Now, does that mean that people actually do that? No, not necessarily. And there are, thousands and thousands of Americans who have lived abroad for decades even, and are continuing to use a US address on their US financial institutions, and this has not been a problem. So again, it works if it works, and that can be temporary or it can be a long-term solution, Katie. Brad, any impact for green card holders returning to Australia, holding a US retirement portfolio in the US? Okay, so you've been in the US and now you're gonna go back to Australia. You got US retirement accounts. Peter, are you gonna have a problem?
Well, I mean, Australia tends to be okay, an okay jurisdiction. I don't know where the account is held, so that's a question. So this whole topic of discussion today could apply. And then I'm thinking, okay, if you're returning to Australia, what are you going to do with your green card? How long have you had your green card? Are you going to be going through formal expatriation, or are you just going to hand it back to the State Department, right? And suddenly my head is spinning. So there's a lot to unpack there for Brad. I think the whole conversation today, though, specific to the account issues, they could apply depending on who Brad has, the account held with.
Right. So there's a lot of 401k providers out there, and they all have different rules with regards to people outside the United States. Probably the best solution to remove the risk that you're going to have a problem is open a Schwab IRA, roll that 401k into that Schwab IRA. Schwab will let you have that account. You can tell them you're in Australia. It's not going to be a problem. As far as the green card goes, that raises tax issues, tax status, and all kinds of other things. That's for another webinar. All right. Thomas writes, does UK still have MiFID II problems after Brexit? We talked about that one, Thomas. All right, now moving on, Jennifer says, I'm just getting started, but I can't find any information about minimum investment requirements with Thun. I'm a dual US-UK citizen residing in the UK. How much would I need to have available to invest and work with you. Jennifer, I'll say this again because it's important, and I'm sure a lot of people are asking it themselves. The minimum to work with our firm is $100,000. At the level of $100,000 to $500,000, you can work with our emerging wealth group, and we can work with you in the UK. Once you get to $500,000, then you will move over to the Thun group, which does a lot more specialized US-UK tax planning and tax strategy, along with investing as well. All right. Maluk writes, we have to create a trust to handle our finances for myself, a US citizen, and my husband, who is still an Afghan national. Can you handle this or our financial matters? I'm sure we can. Well, give us a call. We work on trusts all the time, and trust for foreign nationals when that's appropriate as well. All right, Linda writes, you call this a crisis. Why aren't there more articles about this online from other sources or news outlets? Good question, Linda. It doesn't get a lot of press because, the US press doesn't really follow Americans abroad that much. But I think, there is a fair bit of it if you look for it. There's a lot of different blogs and web services, websites that are covering this stuff pretty closely. US Expat Finance, for example, has articles on this topic almost every week. Peter, anything more you'd say on that?
I would say the term crisis is definitely relevant if you're facing this situation yourself, right? If you're abroad and you get that letter and it says you have 30 days or 90 days to close your account or transfer your assets, but it's already been 89 days because of international mail, which leaves you 1 day left. Yeah, you're having a crisis, Linda. So David is absolutely right. It does not get, national headline press because it doesn't seem to be a universally applicable issue. But for those people going through it, it's a big problem.
Exactly. Yvonne writes, or Peter writes, if your investment company threatens to close your account, how much time will they give you to move your money? We see everything from 30 to 90 days, 6 months sometimes. So it just depends on the institution. Yvonne, as you build wealth, but don't have as much on the side yet, where should Americans abroad invest their money, or should it just be held in a standard bank account until you save $500,000, for example, have $500,000 saved up? No, don't just save cash until you get to the $500,000 mark. If you're below that level, if you have as much as 100,000, we can work with you, and we'll do a great job for you. But if you have less than 100,000 or you want to do it yourself, again, I'll give you the same advice I've given a couple times already on this, but I'll repeat it because it's so important. I recommend that you do it yourself, right? All the foreign providers are going to create problems for you on the tax side. Try to get an account opened in the US at a place like Schwab. You may have to use a US address to do that, depending on what country you're in, and start investing yourself. And you can do it very simply, open a brokerage account and start buying Vanguard ETFs, right? That is a very simple equation. If you just do that, it is a very, very effective way to invest. And you can do that starting with $5,000. All right. Kim writes, I'm an American citizen residing in the UK and have 2 IRAs through Schwab. I have a US address I use on the account. What happens to the IRAs if Schwab decides to close them? I'm relying on these for retirement and currently have no plans to retire abroad. Peter?
In the UK, Schwab, the UK is a good jurisdiction for Schwab, so I don't really see a lot of concerns around that situation. And Kim has a US address as well, so I think she's going to be fine.
Right. But, never say never. Things could change even at Schwab, in which case Kim have to have some backup institution where you can get accounts open and transfer the assets. They'll give you time. But I agree with Peter. You're not going to have a problem with Schwab in the UK on your IRA account. All right, Mark writes, for US citizens abroad, i.e. UK resident. Is there any way for retail investors with moderate wealth who are happy to do their own investment planning able to get access to US registered ETFs via brokerage platforms without having to employ a professional advisor or use a US based address? Okay, well, with that last proviso there, I think, Mark, the answer went from yes in my head to no, because I was about to tell you, just use a US address. But if you don't want to use a US address, right, and you want to do it yourself, no one is going to sell you ETFs. Peter, any further elaboration on that?
I mean, Mark, they value you as a client, but not so much that they want to get in trouble with the regulator.
Right. All right. Adrian writes, I live in Bermuda, and 4 years ago, my investment managers had to close my account with a US address because I was transferring into the account monthly from Bermuda. It took me almost 9 months to find another bank to take me on. After many starts, then they found out where I lived. Still curious as to why I was using a US address, not foreign, but manager had indicated that they didn't want to take the time to get the CDD ETC. Very frustrating. The
CDD, consumer disclosure, something. It sounds more, I don't know, I trying to read between the lines here, but I'm wondering if there was maybe an anti-money laundering concern about frequent cash transfers.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, this is a great example of what goes on, Adrian. You move your account and you're using a US address, but either based on activity in your account or your IP address, the financial institutions determines, hey, this looks suspicious. We think you're outside the United States, and they come and tell you to close the account. It happens all the time. All right, Patrick. For someone on temporary assignment abroad, France, 12 to 24 months, maintaining a household in the US, are the banks usually more lenient? Yes, I think we addressed this one in an earlier case, Patrick. Yes, what I would do is I wouldn't even tell them that you've moved to France temporarily. Just use that US address and you're probably going to be fine. Certainly with Schwab you will be. Michael writes, last time you did a similar presentation, you said that Fidelity and Schwab were safe. Can you please comment on what has changed and what types of actions are being taken by Schwab in particular? Okay, not much has changed in our presentation since the last time. I think a lot of times how we say it, and one thing we say about Schwab or Fidelity gets misinterpreted. So I don't think we ever would have said that Schwab and Fidelity are safe in all cases, in all circumstances. They are certainly safe if you're working with us, right? Because we use Schwab and Fidelity for our clients, and we have strong guarantees that we can work with our clients internationally. But that may not be the case, and it is certainly not the case with Fidelity if you're not working through a US-based investment advisor. Schwab, it may or may not be, depending upon the country. So it's hard to generalize and say Schwab is safe, Fidelity isn't. Well, it depends, right? There's all kinds of every one of these institutions, right? That's why people want to look for simple rules about these things, but there is no simple rule. I can't say that here's the rule at Merrill Lynch, because Merrill Lynch has 30 rules, right? And they apply in 20 different ways in each different country, right? And so that's, it's not quite that bad, say, I'm probably exaggerating there a little bit at Merrill Lynch, but and it's not that bad at Schwab or Fidelity, but yes, it's a lot of nuance and it depends on circumstances, Michael. So no financial institution is safe in all circumstances for every investor in every country. And we've tried to explain the nuance, right? That's what the presentation tried to do, tried to explain the various nuances and how it affects people in different parts of the world. All right, Linda writes.
She's referring to the reference to crisis.
Oh, right. Oh, Linda writes, is this just a marketing ploy by Thun? No, it's not. If I've insinuated here that there's some crisis where there's not, I think Peter's answer was really a good one, right? If you're having your account closed, it's a crisis, and believe me, we say that because we have people calling up here, and they're literally frantic and terrified, and we get a lot of those calls. So I guess to us, because we get so much so many calls about this issue, people in this situation, it feels like a crisis, right? And there are different waves. I mean, we're going through a wave right now with Wells Fargo. A couple of years ago, we were going through a huge wave when the MiFID regulations came about. So there are, you know, this has been a kind of a rolling crisis. So Linda, I'm not trying to just, you know, drum up craziness where there isn't any. It's, you know, if what you've got working is working, and you're not getting threatened to have your account closed, then what you got works, right? And it works until it doesn't. So I would go with that, and hopefully it will never be a crisis for you. All right, John writes, but I appreciate your sentiment there, Linda. Believe me, I understand what you're saying, and I'm not trying to make this. I do not want to make this more dramatic, and I certainly do not want to imply that people need to take action to fix something if it's not broken. Right. My first rule pretty much in this stuff is if you're not having a problem with your financial institution, don't change anything. Right. Maybe you want to look up some backups and have a plan in case you do, but don't go be changing. Don't go change a good situation you have with your I don't know, whoever it is, your Merrill Lynch broker who's not coming down on you simply because you saw this webinar. If it's working, just go with that. All right. Omar writes, how about American Liberties Union on this? Is it lawful to leave a U.S. citizen stranded in another country without access to funds? Where is the Constitution stand with all this? Good question, Omar. Peter, what's constitutional law jurisprudence on this topic?
I don't know. I mean, you and I met firsthand with the lawyer before asking questions around this stuff, and we were unable to get to the bottom of it, and we've been doing this for years and still don't have a right. Yeah. It seems to be that the regulatory rules around distribution and sale of brokerage services, sale of products, those sorts of issues trump any sense of I'm an American, I have rights to my money, etc. Well, you might be a citizen of such and such country, but you're here, right? You can just think the reverse. Somebody, a foreigner, is in the United States. They follow the U.S. laws. They don't decide that they're going to follow the laws of their home country because they are a foreign citizen. No, they're here. They follow U.S. laws. Just like when I lived abroad, I followed foreign laws, etc. So,
right. I would say another bottom line is, look, financial institutions are required to interpret and implement the regulations as they see fit, right? And so they have very broad rights to deny services to people for all kinds of reasons, not just because they're Americans abroad. And they do it on a very regular basis. And there's not much of a legal challenge to that. There is no law that says any financial institution is obligated legally to open or maintain an account for anybody, right? So that's where it really comes down to. Fabian writes, second question, are you, as you surely know, U.S. embassies worldwide are closing for business blaming the pandemic. Have you heard of any opening up soon for expat appointments? I am number 300 on the waiting list in my country with zero indication of when that will resume. Well, no, we've heard about this problem, right? A lot of our clients are waiting desperately to get notarizations on documents, right? And we hear about that one quite a bit. But we know that all of these consular services are way behind. And so I don't really know what the resolution to that is going to be. Peter, any further thought on that?
No.
Okay. Ellen writes, what about owning shares in your employer stock? From an ability to do it, generally okay, right? Employer stock is not a complex U.S. reporting issue. So I think you're okay there, not a problem. Robert writes, does Schwab look the other way if the account size meets a minimum value? Schwab does have a minimum account value for a Schwab One international account, don't they, Peter?
For clients that are not working with us, yes. Direct clients, they have $25,000 minimum. With us, we don't have that minimum, but yeah. Robert, sorry, I mean our minimum, but you know, for a client who needs a second account opened and they have a foreign address and they put $500 in it, it's perfectly fine. Even we open the account before they fund it, it's fine. But otherwise, I've not heard of Schwab saying, oh, well, come on, Robert, you know, you have $10 million. It's okay for you, but for your neighbor who has, you know, 100,000, forget it. No, I've not heard of anything like that where they're segregating and treating people different. I've heard that at different brokerage firms in terms of advisory services and what they'll provide for certain, you know, ultra high net worth versus down to the sort of retail level, and saying, hey, unless you're a certain minimum, we're not going to deal with the cross-border complexities of the compliance and those sorts of issues. But Schwab isn't providing you advisory services, so they're providing you brokerage services.
Okay, great. John writes, as a non-resident American, so presume you're residing outside the United States, can I open a joint account with a resident American friend with, say, Fidelity? Can I also then specify my social security number as the party to whom earnings and capital gains are charged? Basically, the answer to this is no. I mean, yes, you could open a joint tenants account with another person, a friend, if you wanted to. I would not advise it. That is not a good way to set up your affairs, by sharing a joint account with a non-family member. And you certainly cannot direct the payment. Earnings are charged. I mean, you could do your own accounting of who owns the dividends and so forth, and we do recommend that in some cases, where husbands and wives, for example, one is U.S. taxable, one isn't. But what you're describing here, John, as a way to get an account open in the U.S., I don't think that's a good strategy by using a joint tenants account with merely a good friend. And there are better ways to do it. All right, Linda writes, finally, when accounts are closed outside the U.S., what happens to the money usually? Peter noted that his funds were subject to seizure and sent to the U.S. government. Is that the norm? No. Yeah. That's not the norm.
I mean, that was Wells Fargo advisors. I mean, that literally is what they told me. They said I have to call them periodically to let them know I'm still standing. But in most cases, what we see is people saying, you got to get your money out, otherwise we're going to send you a check. And that's the experience, like I mentioned earlier, of somebody who called and said that's exactly what happened to them. And so generally firms will allow you to roll your account or move your account to a different firm that is operating in the jurisdiction that you're resident in.
Right. Odalise writes, with U.S. banks closing U.S. expat accounts, how is the government expected to be paid? For example, amounts due to the IRS or student loans. These entities won't accept payments from foreign accounts. Yeah, I know, it's crazy, isn't it? I mean, one of the many problems that arises in these circumstances. Hart writes, if you're on a temporary solution, U.S.-based address, what activities would possibly flag you as a foreign resident? Will it become more important to have enough residency to pay state level taxes? Well, we heard a couple of good examples earlier, Hart, right? The first one is logging on from a foreign IP. That's why a lot of people should be thinking about using a VPN. In another case that we just heard today, a person said that they were flagged because they were sending a lot of money to their US account from Bermuda. So all of these things might get caught up in a bank's processes for detecting what they might consider indications of fraud or money laundering. And if any of these things trips a wire at a bank, right, they may very well come and say, hey, we think you're operating outside the US, we're gonna close your account. So all of that stuff, any of that stuff could ultimately be what triggers a closure of your account. Will it be more important to have enough residency to pay state tax levels? I'm not sure what that question means. If you use a US address, right, on your investment account, that is not the basis for for a state to charge you taxes in that state. A state may claim you as a taxpayer, but they cannot simply say because you were receiving a mail from your bank at an address in, say, California, that California gets to tax you, right? It's not the way it works. All right. David writes, I'm a US, UK citizen, but have significant funds in a US IRA account that I built up while a green card holder resident in the US for 32 years. I'm distributing these funds and bringing them to the UK as income, but limiting the annual amounts to keep within base UK tax rates. The funds are with Vestra and they use RBC for their financial platform. Do you have any specific knowledge of the risk of Vestra RBC will close my accounts down the foreseeable future? You don't mention Vestra or RBC on your slides. So Vestra is a well-known UK firm that is willing to work with Americans, and they do make investments available at Vestra, including individual stocks and bonds, and I believe they can even do US ETFs, although I'm not sure about that. In fact, I think maybe they used to, but they don't anymore because of MiFID. But do I have any knowledge that this is going to change? No, I don't. We don't have any specific knowledge about that. So I don't really have a lot to elaborate on that, David. Peter, do you have you any recent intel on Vestra?
No, I think what you said, it sounds correct to me though, that maybe their ability to get access to US ETFs has changed since MiFID, but otherwise I haven't heard anything about that issue in particular.
All right, Vivian writes, I moved from US to Germany and kept my US Bank of America account. Is the account closure, okay, got cut off there. So I think you're okay, Vivian, until they tell you have to close it. Annalise writes, is a simple savings account kept in the US with parents' local address, is that account to be closed? Okay, okay, yeah, good question. We've answered lots, so let's skip over that one. Paul writes, do US expats have congressional senatorial representatives assigned to them, or is this effectively taxation without representation? No, Americans abroad do not have congressional senatorial representatives assigned to them. Anne writes, as a follow-up to the question about using a US address, are certain US brokerage firms policing the location of their client in particular more than others, checking IP addresses? Yes, and some are, some aren't, right? Clearly, some are more than others. Yes, clearly that's the case. All right, Valerie writes, can your EU residing country make you sell your US ETF if you are trading yourself in your US brokerage account? No. If you have a US account and you're trading ETFs, the country in which you reside cannot intervene and force that to stop. Hypothetically, of course, your financial institution would be the one who would force you to stop, and they might do it because they're worried about the regulations in that country, right? But your local authority is not going to intervene and say, hey, we found out that you're trading ETFs in the US in a brokerage account, and you have to stop that. It's not the way it will happen. All right. Annalise writes, in relation to FATCA, do I have any obligations to tell an employer abroad I am both US and UK tax resident? No, I don't think you do. You might want to for various reasons, but I don't think there's any legal obligation to disclose that. Dara writes, are VPNs and smart DNS proxy servers effective means to conceal your IP address? Aren't there GDPR privacy rights associated with your IP address? Peter, GDPR and VPNs, do you know anything about that connection?
I mean, the VPN, I think is the answer to the first question is yes, conceal your IP address. GDPR privacy rights associated with your IP address, that I'm not aware. I thought it was based on your physical location, but maybe you know it differently.
All right, I'm still here. I'm just turned off my camera for a second.
All right.
Moving on. Yeah, Jennifer writes, so opening a brokerage account in the US and granting a relative in the US with power of attorney, is that a good strategy? In that case, even if I look at the account online from outside the US, would I be protected from the account being closed? Peter?
I would say power of attorney, not a bad idea. If anything, if you became incapacitated, then somebody still has access to assist you with things. But I don't think that resolves the issue about you being outside the US per se, because the account's registered to you, not to the power of attorney.
Right, I've just sat down for the rest of this presentation. Thank you. All right, next one, Rudy says, does Thun Financial have requirements to report his clients' assets to the foreign country in which those clients reside? Good question, let me clarify this. No, we do not, definitively, we do not report. Your assets are held not at Thun Financial or Creative Planning, they are held at Schwab or Fidelity. Those institutions have a variety of reporting requirements to the US government, and the US government in turn may report and share that information with foreign governments, right? If it's done under the terms of FATCA, they will do that if you are they may potentially do that if you're a non-US citizen. If you are a US citizen, they will not do it under terms of FATCA. When would they do it? If a foreign country, friendly foreign country is asking for cooperation on a criminal investigation, by all means, the US government routinely shares that kind of information with foreign governments in questions of criminal investigations and so on and so forth. All right, hope that helps. Next question from Danielle says, you said that if you're a US citizen in the EU or the UK, you shouldn't invest in non-US ETFs. Does that include US equities traded abroad, e.g. the Vanguard 500 S&P 500 ETF traded in the UK, purchased through a UK brokerage firm? Good question. Peter?
Yes, that is, it's kind of interesting, right? Because you're getting the same market exposure, but the legal wrapper for that is not a US investment, right? That's a non-US ETF, as you wrote in your question. So that would be a passive foreign investment company investment. Those sorts of investments, we use those for clients who reside in certain countries and are not US taxpayers at all. But for you, if you're a US citizen, a US green card holder, or an elective US taxpayer, and we're talking about in a brokerage account, meaning a fully taxable account, you definitely want to be investing into US located, registered, domiciled, CITES, ETF, whatever terminology you want, a US ETF. So that would be a no-go. A non-US ETF tracking the S&P 500 for a US citizen in their brokerage account, don't do it. You have a passive foreign investment company.
Good. Okay, Dennis writes, are dual UK Americans in the UK required to disclose to their UK bank that they are also American citizens, or can they simply use their UK passport to open an account as long as they fill out the FATCA form every year? No, you don't have to volunteer that information. A lot of banks, my understanding is they now routinely ask this question, or they ask questions that are designed to figure out if you're an American. And so, sometimes you see that, people think, oh my God, I'm going to, if I don't answer every single one of these questions that the bank is asking me 100% honestly, I'm going to be arrested or something like that. That's not the case, right? This is a problem for the bank, right? This is not a problem for the account holder. So they want to get the right answer, but if they don't, right, they're not going to report you to the police and have you arrested. They're simply going to have to wonder whether or not they're getting the right information and whether or not they should go ahead and open the account for you or not. All right, Anthony writes, would it be possible for Congress to pass legislation prohibiting U.S. financial institutions from refusing to do business with U.S. citizens living abroad? I guess it would be possible. It's not going to happen because it's for all kinds of reasons, Anthony, but I guess they could. All right, Michael
I
writes.
suppose it depends on the country you're in too, right?
Yeah.
Right. If you're in certain countries, the U.S. already has limits on doing business with that country. So
Michael writes, you mentioned USAA. Are they actively closing accounts now that their investment service has been acquired by Schwab? Yeah, USAA has been closing accounts for a long time, although you're right. I mean, they don't really have an investment business anymore. So now all that's been moved to Schwab, and now you're dealing with Schwab, and Schwab is basically the most lenient big provider in the U.S. for Americans abroad. So you're probably much better off at Schwab than you were at USAA. All right. Adelise writes, what is the U.S. citizen obligation when in good faith approaches an institution of an employer pension provider and asks whether a FATCA form is needed to be completed, and the response is no? We don't need anything. Is the U.S. citizen liable for lack of action by the institution? No, absolutely not. The U.S. citizen is, you're not going to be held liable for a decision about whether or not a service was provided or not provided, or whether an account was closed or not closed. That is it's a problem potentially legally for the financial institution. I've never heard of any case, any situation, even remotely indicating that somehow the individual client was held responsible or legally responsible for some information that was provided or not provided. I mean, the only, I guess, exception that I would make to that statement is, you know, if you are engaged in money laundering or arms dealing and you are being investigated by the U.S. government, it may very well be that they will use something like you were providing false information in an attempt to circumvent U.S. laws, right, in a material way, and that they could use that against you. But they're not using it routinely to say, wow, you were an American abroad and you were using a U.S. address and now you're in big trouble. No, not happening. Vivian writes, I moved from the U.S. to Germany and kept my U.S. Bank of America account. Is there an account closure issue also a problem with debit card accounts or only with investment accounts? Peter, Bank of America, bank account?
debit card or only investment accounts? Well, debit card account being a bank account, presumably, I think it's at the institutional level. So I don't know specifically about Bank of America if there's any issues there. I don't have any insights on Bank of America. I don't think there's, you know, necessarily a difference for them whether the bank or the investment account. I would think that you should be okay. Have you heard anything about Bank of America?
No. I mean, a lot of people have Bank of America accounts around the world.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I think you're okay. Jeffrey writes, should I worry about transferring money from Wells Fargo to my bank account in France? No, I mean, you're free to do that. There's nothing illegal about moving money from the U.S. to France. Whether or not you want to do, you want to do that, I wouldn't recommend you do that. Open up an investment account in France and start investing in Vis-A-Vis or other French investment products. That's going to create a huge U.S. tax problem for you. But just transferring money to France is not.
Yeah, I think it's this question comes up from time to time, David, where people worry that, oh, if I send a wire to this country, is that an indication that I'm in that country? And I just gave away, right? I'm using a U.S. address. Suddenly I send a wire to France, and now Wells Fargo goes, hey, well, why are you sending money to France? You're in France, aren't you?
Oh yeah. Oh, okay. Good point. Yes, I see. Well, if it's Wells Fargo, they're going to kick you. Yeah, you're right. Okay, good point. You may be using a U.S. address on your Wells Fargo and getting away with that. But yeah, if you send too many wires to France, they might. Yeah, good point, Peter. I understand. I hope that helps. Karen writes, can you know of any German bank that will let Americans have bank accounts? Yes, there are lots of banks in Germany that will allow you as an American to open up a bank account. Very few of them will let you open up an investment account, although some of them will, because we still hear of Americans opening up investment accounts and buying mutual funds in Germany and finding out that they're PFICs. But that's getting increasingly restricted. Yeah, but bank accounts for Americans in Germany, as in most countries, generally you're able to open up a local bank account, even though you're an American. Omar writes, will there be a problem of closing an existing 403B or 457 account for an individual living in Turkey currently? Closing one of those accounts? No, I don't think so. No, I don't think you're gonna have a problem with that. Scott writes, are you Middle East? What are the tax implications for a U.S. citizen opening a business in a free zone of Dubai? Okay, well, that's a huge question, Scott. What are the tax implications for a U.S. citizen opening a business abroad? Give us a call, right? There are a lot of issues, but not really the topic of today's presentation. All right, James, right? David, you mentioned Japan and Singapore as markets that are more restrictive than others as far as countries whose expats are policed more aggressively on this issue. Could you add more color to this, Peter?
Yeah, it's really the local regulatory environment that causes the brokerage firms to operate the way they do. The regulators of Japan and Singapore are known to be pretty restrictive themselves, and so depending on the business registration of the brokerage firm in that particular country will determine their own approach to working with clients in that country. And we see a wide spectrum of outcomes, from fully acceptable to not acceptable at all. So we just find those they're not the only two countries that fall under the more restrictive sort of list, if you will, amongst the countries that we work with clients in. But as I said, we're fortunate that we have a spectrum of choices to choose from in terms of our custodial relationships, so we're able to pick the right partner depending on which country the client's in.
Great. Good. Next question from Mish. Have you seen accounts being frozen, restricted, like cash depositing? So I think, what do you mean, like a cash account, like a bank account? Have we seen those being restricted? Well, as we've said, the most common restrictions and the most widespread restrictions and closures are happening with investment accounts, less so with bank accounts. But yes, we do know that some banking institutions are closing even bank accounts. That seems to be highly a function of what country you're in. Banks won't provide any services of any type in some countries. They'll provide bank accounts, but not investment accounts in other countries, and so on and so forth. So definitely we have heard of that happening, but in general, bank accounts are easier to get and maintain when you're an American abroad, depending upon the country in which you're in. All right, Ted writes, if I were to suddenly get an account closure notice from my only U.S. brokerage, how would Thun Financial be able to deal with it? Yeah, well, we deal with that every single day here. Peter, what do we do?
Well, first thing is we pick the right partner for you. Depending on if you're already at one of our partnership custodians, we might try to get access to that account. And then if necessary, we would relocate your account to one of the partners that is able to work with clients in your jurisdiction.
Right. Jason writes, do foreign investment restrictions apply to foreign government pensions accrued by U.S. citizens while working in those countries? Thanks. We kind of talked about this a little bit earlier. Americans with employer pensions in a foreign country generally are pretty safe. They don't seem to get restricted very often. I have heard of a few cases now, even in the UK, where people have left employment and they are no longer in a company plan, but they're just they own it like through a SIP in the UK, or just they're no longer with the company. And I have heard of some cases where some of the providers will say, hey, we're not taking Americans who are no longer connected to their employer, and force you to move them. Fortunately, there are still lots of institutions in the UK that will take you to take your old UK employer pension and move it to a new institution. So I think you're going to have lots of options there. So I think one way or another, you're probably going to be okay. Just look around. how are you getting around regulations for licensing in the country where the client is residing when providing investment advice to the client? That's a good question, Dawn. We spend a lot of time making sure that the way we operate does not conflict or impede on any foreign jurisdiction regulations where our clients reside. The key thing is to recognize is that when you work with us, you may be in Germany, you may be in the UK, you may be in Japan, but you are working with us here in the United States. We maintain accounts for you in the United States. Your advisors working with Thun are here in the United States. And in general, that allows us not to be regulated in the other country. I say in general because there are some countries where we have to be careful about how we market. In the UK, even though we're outside of the UK, we cannot take clients who have less, who are not considered qualified investors for UK purposes. So there are a series of regulations country by country that we have to be aware of. But in general, right, as long as we are in the United States, we are delivering services here in the United States, the fact that our client may reside outside the United States, we generally are not regulated in that country. All right. Chloe writes, when an account is closed by the financial institution, what happens to the asset? Oh, we've talked a lot about that, Chloe. Charles writes, Switzerland have not been part of the EU since forever. What do the regulations say about residents of Switzerland? Well, we've talked a little bit about this already, right? And yes, Switzerland is not the EU, so a lot of the EU restrictions don't apply in Switzerland. Schwab is perfectly open to working with clients in Switzerland, but many other institutions are not, because Switzerland is still a foreign country and a lot of institutions are simply restricting people outside of the United States. Any further elaboration on that, Peter?
No.
Okay. Is your minimum for becoming a client still $500,000 in assets? It is. That's for working with the Thun group. However, this comes from April. We now have a group called the Emerging Wealth Group, and they take clients inside the United States and outside the United States with as little as $100,000 of assets. All right, Valerie writes, you just said you cannot buy or sell US ETFs when living in the UK when directly trading with Schwab, but I assume you can still sell what you had previously bought. Yes, I believe that's true, Valerie. Would you agree, Peter?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, really the regulations are about the point of sale. Those regulations that are affecting brokerage accounts and affecting the distribution of investment products is about the point of those things, services and products being sold to you, and whether or not those services and products are compliant with that regulation of that jurisdiction. So I've not heard of issues on restricting the selling of existing assets, but once you sell it, you can't reinvest it in a US ETF. So then you become a little bit choked. David, I'm gonna read Carlos's question if I could. That says, are current holdings of US mutual funds at the time of moving to the EU safe, or they have to be divested of? And you don't have to sell US mutual funds when you move abroad to the EU, for example, similar to what is being asked here about whether you can sell once what you already have, right? And we said, sure, you can sell. So you can hang on to your US mutual funds. Question is, should you? US mutual funds in certain countries in the EU are not tax friendly. So you actually may want to sell your US mutual funds before going and becoming a resident of that country and switch into US ETFs because it's more tax friendly for you. So something we can help you analyze depending on which country you're going to. Feel free to reach out.
Okay, great. All right, Peter, we had a couple questions submitted via email before the webinar. Let's just go through those quickly. I'll ask you to answer this first one. Will writes, hello, I live in Canada and have my brother's address in California as a place where I get my mail. The state of California now reached out to me and is looking into whether or not I owe back taxes to the state of California. I would like to ask what your opinion, what options do I have in this situation?
Yeah, so I'm from California. Franchise Tax Board is a pretty aggressive taxing entity, and so if they're seeing, you know, a California address on a 1099, they may come after you. They're not the only state that does that. We've had experience with clients who've lived outside the United States for decades and gotten similar sort of notices from Colorado, Virginia, New York, etc. In those cases, you go back to the, in this case, Franchise Tax Board, the taxing agent of California, and provide them an explanation of your circumstances. Simply having a California mailing address does not, in and of itself, determine you to be a California tax resident. Now, if there's other circumstantial factors there, like you're spending more than 30 days a year in California or something along those lines, and you're actually a California resident, well, your story's not going to do you a whole lot of good, right? In my case, I submitted an explanatory letter along with the 540 NR. The 540 is the California equivalent of the 1040, NR meaning non-resident. So I was like drawing a line in the sand year in and year out. Even though I had California source passive income, I was saying I'll pay you tax on this passively sourced California income, but otherwise my earnings from outside of California, I'm not going to pay you tax on. And I didn't have any issues. So I think you're fine to go back to them, explain your circumstances, and you should be okay. But of course, you know, I don't speak for the FTB. That's just been my own personal experience, and I've seen that work for our clients with other states as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the key in all these state tax questions is that when you leave, you need to be able to demonstrate that when you left, you had no intention of returning, right? That's true for every state, I think, except for Virginia, where they have a different standard. By establishing that you did not intend to return, and you didn't return, then they can't claim that you continued to be taxable there. All right. All right, one more from Robert came in before the webinar. It says, looking forward to your webinar on Thursday. One question for it. Are institutions closing accounts for Americans who are moving to U.S. territories? It would seem those accounts would be okay. If we're talking about U.S. territories, Puerto Rico and U.S. Virgin Islands, and I think you clarified that later, Robert, that that's what you were concerned with. We don't see any restrictions with the institutions that we deal with, Schwab or Fidelity for Puerto Rico or the U.S. Virgin Islands. I think you're going to be able to open accounts there and maintain accounts there. I know that's true for Schwab. I'm not 100% sure that that's true for Fidelity with respect to the Virgin Islands. Other financial institutions, you know, I think generally you're going to find that this is pretty open to U.S. territories, but I'm not 100% sure. It's really a question of going to the institution and asking them. Right. All right. Let's move on here. Jennifer writes, I'm a dual U.S. ITA citizen. I presume that's yes. And where I am planning to retire. I will repeat my question. Would opening a U.S. brokerage account with a U.S. address and granting a U.S. relative power of attorney protect the account from being closed? No, not definitively, Jennifer. We have heard cases where financial institutions have said, hey, if you're outside the United States, your account is frozen, and the only way we'll even talk to you is if you grant power of attorney to someone who is in the United States who has that authority to give us instructions. Okay, that's kind of separate from whether or not they're going to close the account, right? And I've never heard of a case where the decision to the account will be closed unless you get a power of attorney. So I don't think that that's going to be the strategy you want to employ. Furthermore, it's not a good way to manage your finances by having to have someone in the United States with a power of attorney just to conduct financial matters for you. I mean, to some extent, I mean, that's what we do. We grant powers of attorneys so that if we have medical needs, someone can act on our behalf. But just as a general approach, I think there are better ways. All right, I hope that helps, Jennifer, and I hope that that's answering the question. Diana writes, is there anything specific to Hong Kong that might pose additional problems to the ones you've already outlined? Peter?
I mean, from a financial planning side of things, yeah, Hong Kong is a different taxing jurisdiction, different rules, et cetera. In terms of the whole account closure question, et cetera, Hong Kong's no different than any other jurisdiction. Some brokerage firms are very comfortable with Hong Kong and some are not.
Right.
So Interactive Brokers is an example of one that's not as comfortable. Schwab is an example of one that is more comfortable.
Right. All right, next question comes from Jody. Will U.S.-Swiss dual citizen have problems with a Schwab account? Any suggestions for U.S.-Swiss dual citizen resident in Switzerland? Okay, so one thing you can say is generally from the U.S. side, the U.S. financial institutions, when making these decisions, are not really concerned with your citizenship. They're concerned with your residency, right? Foreign financial institutions are often concerned with your citizenship if that citizenship is U.S., right? Because it is the U.S. citizenship that makes you subject to FATCA from their point of view for compliance, for their compliance point of view, right? But there's nothing special about whether you're a U.S. citizen or a Swiss citizen or both with respect to having a Schwab account in Switzerland. You can do it. Americans or non-Americans resident in Switzerland, you can call up Schwab and open an account. All right, I hope that helps. Charles writes, just now on the tax haven question, you mentioned using non-resident alien spouses to invest in foreign assets. Is there any downside to having a non-resident alien spouse invest in U.S. stocks, ETFs? Yes, potentially. Peter?
Yeah, well, it really depends where you live, Charles. So are you in a, yeah. Okay, there's a couple things. Transferring assets to a non-resident alien spouse, if you're both resident in the UK, there's not really a good tax arbitrage there because you're both subject to UK tax rates. And maybe you want to income split a little bit, but otherwise you're not really getting a big advantage. Now, if you're in a low tax jurisdiction and you want to transfer wealth to your non-resident alien spouse and invest in their name, let's say you're in the Middle East or Hong Kong or Singapore where they're not going to tax the investment portfolio, hey, that's great. You can get some tax benefit. You now invest into US ETFs, you're going to get withheld at 30% on dividends. So that, wait, what happened to my tax benefit? That goes away. And then the second part is, if those assets are left behind to a non-US citizen spouse, then you're going to face potentially very onerous US estate taxation on that investment portfolio of US assets. So there's ways to circumvent that. Investing into European ETFs is one potential solution. It really depends on which country you're in, Charles, where you're planning to go, and those sort of circumstances. We do have articles on our website, mixed nationality couple articles that go into more detail on this. So feel free to read through that on the Thun Financial website. And then if you still have questions thereafter, reach out and we'll be happy to talk specifics with you.
Great. All right, Wenning writes, sorry, I may have missed this. How about TD Ameritrade? Yeah, TD Ameritrade does not work. Generally, they do not allow foreign addresses on accounts. You may have a TD Ameritrade account with a US address, and if it's working, it's working. And of course, TD Ameritrade is in the process of being acquired by Schwab. So eventually you're gonna end up at Schwab, and that's generally pretty much the best place. So hope that helps, Wenning. You're probably okay. Mark writes, what about, I think we've answered that question quite a few times. Diana writes, is the deferred annuity scheme launched in Hong Kong in July 2018 a no-no for US taxpayers? Well, not really an account opening question, but yeah, non-US deferred annuities are almost always going to be very complex to report on a US tax return and punitively treated. So I wouldn't go there. All right, Albert writes, if one wants to convert US Fidelity account into a German Fidelity account, does this mean selling all assets in the US account and then buying in Germany? Or is there a way to transfer accounts between countries? I don't know, Peter, do you know? I didn't know that you could open a German account at Fidelity. I know Fidelity has a business in the UK that is unrelated to its US business, or it's owned, but it's completely separate. And so
Right.
in Fidelity, you can get a UK account open. I didn't know there was a similar offering in Germany. Are you aware of
Yeah,
this?
I'm kind of wondering if Albert meant just changing your address, but yeah, if you're establishing an account, first of all, changing your address on an existing US brokerage account, that's not a change in the account, right? That's a registration issue. The account doesn't itself just move to the country where you change the address to. But if you're talking about opening a new brokerage account, completely new in a different country with the same, even the same branded company like Fidelity, you have to talk to the local brokerage firm whether or not they can house those assets. We do work with clients in terms of transferring assets held abroad into US brokerage accounts, and then we have to find the right brokerage partner who's able to house those assets. If they're US assets, chances are any US brokerage can take them. If you're talking about if you happen to have European assets in your US brokerage account, then that German entity is likely to be able to hold it. Can they hold US investments? I don't know. That you would need to talk to them specifically, because again, we do a lot. Look, in our work, in case this point hasn't come across, we spend a lot of time talking to the various custodians that we work with. Our operations team, which is fantastic, by the way, they communicate a lot with the custodians, trying to understand which custodians, this, that, and the other. So we spend a lot of time on the operational aspects, much more than, let's say, when we're dealing with a US-based client. Okay, it's a free-for-all. Any US-based client for a US custodian, you're okay there, right? We're buying US investments in the US for a US resident client, a US custodian. It all works. That's easy. Here, we're talking about so many jurisdictions and complexities. We're really dealing with these issues in detail. So you're going to need to reach out, Albert, and do some of that work in terms of speaking to the German, what we would call the contra firm, to find out what they can and cannot do.
Yeah, but I would underline what you said right off the bat, Peter, just to make sure that this is not, Albert's got this straight. If you have a Fidelity account, Albert, and you're changing your address to Germany, okay, that's not opening a German account. That may have a German address on it, but it is a US account and will remain a US account. Although I don't think Fidelity is going to let you do that.
Yeah, I don't think so either.
All right.
I mean, one thing that's interesting is even you open accounts like TD Ameritrade has an office in Singapore. If you go down there and open an account at TD Ameritrade, it's a US account. It's not a Singapore account. So the underlying account itself, even if you open the account in some foreign jurisdiction, may or may not be an account in that jurisdiction.
Right. Same thing with Schwab in London. You go walk into Schwab in London and open an account. You're opening a US account, actually. All right. Moving on, Chloe writes, I'm a US citizen and today suddenly one of my bank accounts at Capital One, but not Capital One 360, was closed. Could this be related? Yeah, it could be, certainly could be. Colin, following up on the interactive brokers questions, if you must open an interactive brokerage account in your country of residence, i.e. Australia, does this really matter? As I understand that interactive brokers can purchase US stocks, bonds, ETFs with international Australian accounts with either US or Australian dollars.
Yeah, but you can do that at Schwab too and other brokerage firms. So.
Right, Jody writes, my experience with Citibank was awful. It is just like any other local bank. Yeah,
all right. Jody, I feel you a bit on that one, but they are one of the more global banks.
Right. All right. Mark writes, if I try and open a Schwab brokerage account using a US address whilst living in the UK, Schwab will still want to know my social security and my employer's address and phone, which will be UK based. Will this be an issue in trying to open the Schwab account whilst resident in the UK? Yes, it will be an issue. If you call up Schwab and say that you live in California, but you work in London, that will be a red flag and you won't do it. So call yourself self-employed, or give a generic U.S. address for your employer, even though they're UK, something like that. Yes, it's got to be consistent. And yes, yeah, putting a UK employer but a California address will not fly. All right, Mark writes, how can I find out the situs of where an ETF is held or domiciled? Good question. For example, if a Vanguard SP 500 are managed in the UK, is it US situs or UK domiciled? Good question. Peter, how do we look at a fund?
So there's security identifiers. The US being the US, right? We do things a little bit differently than the rest of the world. We have something called the CUSIP, C-U-S-I-P. That's one way to know. So if you have a CUSIP, chances are it's a US registered security. Alternatively, the rest of the world tends to use something called the ISIN, Individual Security Identification Number. If that starts with the letters US, then it's going to be a US security. If it starts with IE, GB, other letters, DE, etc., then those are foreign registered securities. So then you have a PFIC problem.
All right, Peter, we are been going for almost 3 hours now. We still have a lot of questions. So we are now going to start getting really aggressive about not answering questions that have been, we're going to go to the lightning round. If it's been close to being, we're not going to even cover it here. And only focusing on the new and unique questions. So here we go. Do you have competent cross-border accountants on board, or can you refer them to me? Due to repetitive mistakes or inaccurate advice, I have switched multiple times in Canada and other expats. I know who have had similar experiences. Yes, we have a great network of expat tax preparers we work with. Email us and we will send you the name of one or two who do a good job for Canada. Paula writes, if you reside most of the year overseas but have a legitimate U.S. address that you spend a bit of time, is there a minimum amount of time physical presence in the U.S. That would accept for a legitimate U.S. address? Paula, well, we've described that you can get away using a U.S. address and spending no time in the U.S. So I don't know that there's a specific amount of time. You'd have to call the financial institution and say what their rule is. They probably may or may not say, yeah, you got to be in the United States at least 183 days of the year for you to call yourself resident in the U.S. to be able to put a U.S. address. But whatever their rule is versus what actually works may be two different things. All right, Lisa writes, I'm in Germany and have heard that it is possible to privately invest in U.S. ETFs as a U.S. person abroad through a non-traditional investment company such as Kingdom Trust. But I have been unable to find, information about this. Do you happen to know anything about it at all? Peter? Kingdom Trust?
No,
never heard of it.
They're in the U.S. though, it looks like. They're in Kentucky.
All right, Colin.
Any different than just using one of the other discount brokerages. Okay, sorry.
Right. Colin writes, what's the problem? What would the problem come from the fact that the reporting for U.S. tax purposes is substandard?
Continuing. All right.
I'm not sure. Follow up previous question. All right. Mark writes, if non-U.S. property is held under a UK limited company, is that considered a PFIC for capital gains? Good question. Common question, but let's try to answer it. Peter, you've got a UK company, you've got income.
Depends, is it an operating company? Is that what your business is? Or is it just a passive investment company? You might have controlled foreign corporation reporting. You might have PFIC reporting if this is just an entity that it's like you created your own little mutual fund to buy real estate. Yeah, I would say you potentially have a PFIC issue. But if you're talking about that's your day job, then you probably don't have a PFIC issue, but you'll still have a CFC issue.
Right, controlled foreign corporation issue. All right, Ariel says, does having investments under the name of a non-U.S. citizen spouse protect against taxation by the U.S.? Maybe yes, maybe no. It depends whether or not that U.S. citizen, that non-U.S. citizen spouse is themselves subject to U.S. taxation. If you're married filing jointly, that spouse is. If that person is a green card holder, it could be lots of circumstances. So it might be a way to get out of U.S. taxation on your investments, but it depends on the circumstances. All right, Lisa writes, do you, as Thun, consult with creative planning about U.S. citizens abroad accounts. Can you tell us a bit more about how you work together? Okay, so Thun Financial is creative planning, Lisa. Good question, by the way. I want to make this very, very clear. We are the group within creative planning that deals with clients outside the United States. Creative planning has various groups that specialize in different areas, and we are one of those groups that specializes in working with Americans abroad. Yes, we consult with creative planning very, very closely every day on all kinds of issues related to Americans abroad. We are creative planning, and they are us, and we work very, very closely with our colleagues who are at creative planning, but not Thun, right? All right, I hope that clarifies. Sue writes, if one has any cash account in the U.S., it would be advantageous to transfer outside of the U.S. Is that correct?
One has any cash accounts in the it would be able to transfer outside the U.S. Is that correct? Oh.
It seems as though Wells Fargo is the first, and other banks will soon follow.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, Sue, it depends on your circumstances. It may be the right thing for you to move your money to a bank account in the country where you live. It may not be. It's really contingent upon all kinds of circumstances. All right, Sergey writes, what do brokerages do with IRA 401ks when they find out that the account holder currently resides abroad? Do they automatically sell all the investments, or do they allow the owner to transfer the stock ETFs to a different IRA 401k? Well, they certainly allow you to, right? But I guess the answer the cases we've seen is if you don't respond soon enough, eventually you don't respond and don't get it out of there in the time that they've allotted you, yes, they may simply sell them and send you a check, and that results in a distribution, potentially early distribution, all these kinds of problems. So don't ignore financial institutions that's saying, hey, you got to move your 401k or your IRA because you're an American abroad. Eventually, it will probably become a problem. All right, Chris writes, any restrictions or conditions unique to Canada regarding maintaining U.S. investment accounts for U.S. expats? Yes, yes, Canada is the most restricted country. It is the most difficult place for us to work with Americans or Canadians. Really the only case now where we can work with people in Canada is when the only account we manage is a U.S. IRA. If they also have investment accounts, we cannot manage them. So that's basically the answer, the most pertinent thing you need to know, Chris. Sabine writes, Fidelity told me I was outside of the USA from checking my phone number on calls.
Right.
Good information, Sabine. Thank you for sharing. There you go. All right, Ellen writes, thank you for the information. You're welcome, Ellen. All right, Noga writes, if my investable cash funds are partly in CAD, Canadian dollars, do you require it to be converted to US dollars in order to manage it? Would this cause a potential loss depending upon the currency exchange fees? All right, well, we have a whole webinar coming up on currency in a month. So I'm going to defer that question to that topic to that question, though, because that's a complex question to answer. The very short answer is to invest with us through Schwab or Fidelity, yes, you would have to convert your currency first to US dollars before we then turn around and invest it in global stocks and bonds. All right, Robert writes, okay, more IP questions. Thank you for the shout out to ACA. You're welcome, Michael. ACA does a great job. I should have also mentioned the AARO, Association of Americans Resident Abroad. They also do a great job, as do various other U.S. expat organizations. All right. Oh, but Michael follows on and says, not true. They have made significant gains on residency-based taxation. I hope they have, Michael. I think you're saying that the ACA has made significant gains on residency-based taxation. I hope they have. I guess I need an update from the ACA on the progress that's being made because I haven't heard about it. And reading the tea leaves, which I do a fair bit of, I'm still skeptical. But prove me wrong. All right, Rudy says, if one becomes a citizen of the EU country, may we still use Thun Financial as our broker, or does this not make sense at that point? No, absolutely. Yeah, that's what we do. Once you become a citizen of a EU country, you should contact us, if not before, on your way to the EU country, right? That's what this whole presentation is about. We have the solution for you. Call us, right? All right, Michael writes, All right, okay. Suzanne writes, forgive me if I missed information on this, but are non-U.S. public sector retirement funds considered PFICs?
Oh, yeah. So I think non-public sector retirement, but it depends on the country, Suzanne. So if you could tell us which country you're in, we can guide you. So like that's what I have. I have a public sector retirement fund. The fund itself is not a PFIC. The underlying investments, because that fund doesn't provide any sheltering. So the IRS looks through to the underlying. So then depending on what I invest in, I might have to report PFICs. I certainly have to report all the income in that account. So it's from the IRS point of view, it's like a brokerage account. But there are other public sector pensions or other foreign pensions generally that are protected by a tax treaty. And then therefore the IRS just says, okay, you're okay. Whatever's inside, I don't look. I just look, it's okay, the pension scheme, and off you go.
Okay, a couple more that I'll answer. Charles writes, AARO, Association of Americans Resident Overseas, is also lobbying for Americans who live abroad. Yes, they are, and I've already said it. So I didn't forget about you, Charles. And I didn't even have to get prompted. But thank you, it's true. AARO is doing a great job. Now, Mary Louise writes, David, actually ACA has made massive advancements. Not sure if you attended our webinar yesterday, but we'll share with you once it is live. Oh, okay, I guess there is new information. Maybe the ACA is really getting somewhere with residency-based taxation. That would be new information, and I would love to hear it because it's very, very important to our clients. So thank you, Mary Louise, for pointing that out, and I want to get in touch with you very soon to talk about that. If something big's going on, we want to know about it, and certainly our clients do. All right. Yes, Michelle Paul adds in, oh, it's all policy now. Democrats abroad have a team constantly lobbying on this. Yes, that's true. I should have thought of them too, because they've been very active in this area, and they're doing a great job. And we've actually made presentations on this topic to Democrats abroad. And so, yeah, they're also working very hard for Americans all over the world. All right. I'll also say the Republicans abroad several years ago were also working very, very hard on this issue too. Now, just staying it now.
You better just mention all the groups, David, before the next question is.
All right. Yes, okay. Oh no, more. Okay. Okay, so I'm not going to get too much into a discussion of U.S. Policy further than we have already here. But thank you, Michael. Thomas writes, thank you very much for the seminar. It's very informative. You're welcome, Thomas. All right, James writes, I would like to start investing more proactively, specifically for my child's college education. U.S. expat living in abroad long term. Would you recommend a regular brokerage account in my name or the child's name? It is also very uncertain where the funds will be used in the future. Do you have any advice how to diversify the investments so that currency will be less of a risk when the funds will be most likely converted from US dollars to another currency? James, a really good question. We cover this in a lot of webinars, a lot of presentations on our website. It's really not today's topic. So I'm going to pass on this one. Give us a call and we'll answer that one. It's also a very long answer that we would have to give. So we want to do it justice, but we haven't got time on this presentation. All right. Do you offer a robo-type advisory investment option? No, not really. Rudy writes, may we keep our U.S. mutual funds if we are Thun financial clients, or must they be sold after transfer in kind? Good question, Peter.
No, we hang on to them if they make sense for you. We'll analyze that and let you know. So, like I said earlier, certain countries, U.S. mutual funds are actually not good for you, so you would want to sell them, but we don't force your hand. We advise you. Yep.
Neither do our custodians. They would not force you to sell them. All right. Michael writes, point is that it seems that Americans, citizens living abroad, are being discriminated against by all the.
Yes. Michael, I feel you.
Right. Bernard writes, I used to work for Citi and have my savings there. I have mostly lived in the UK, but always had a US passport. Should I be thinking of moving my savings out of Citi private wealth banking? I think, well, look, we'll do a lot better job for you on investing than Citi private wealth banking will. I'm very confident of that, but I'm biased. That's a question of, making the case that we can do a better job investing. I think probably if you've got your assets at Citi Wealth, they're probably not going to close them, or they would have done it by now. They probably know you're in the UK. So I don't think you have an account closing issue there. But if you want to get better investment results, and if you want detailed cross-border US, UK investing and financial planning, then let's, all right. Yes. Jay writes.
It's more he's schooling us on the IT stuff.
Yeah, I think we're going to skip over any more questions about VPNs. All right. John writes, does term life insurance from a company like Unisure in the UK, South Africa, Malaysia, for me living in Japan, a problem with PFIX, or just insurance products like whole life? Yeah, good question.
Yes.
Peter?
Yes. Short answer, speed around, yes. Term life is fine. Whole life with value tied to it, more problematic.
Yes. Term is good. Everything else is a problem.
We'd tell you that in the US anyway.
Yes.
Yes.
What about owning shares in your employer's stock as an employee benefit in Sweden? Thank you. Ellen, that's probably fine.
Yeah.
Lisa writes, are German Reister and Ruhr retirement policies accepted by US German double taxation treaty? Generally, you can say the policies have to be tied to employment, right? I'm not familiar with Reister and Ruhr specifically, unless you are, Peter. But
isn't that Reister Renta? Isn't that the
Reister Renta? You're right. Yeah, and those are generally either their government, Social Security, or their pension schemes tied to employment. All of those are covered by treaty, right? If it's just something that you walk into a bank and you open an account and they call it a pension, it's not covered by treaty. What about US crypto investments? I'm not sure what about them. Yeah.
Okay.
Rosemary says, should all property be converted to investment accounts if it is overseas and owned in a dual American-French citizen living in the EU? Should all property be converted to investment account? I'm not sure what she's asking. Peter, do you?
No, I'm not sure, because property to an investment account, when I think of property, I think real estate, but I don't think that's what she means to an investment account.
Give us a call, Rosemary, and we'll get to the bottom of that one. All right. Herbert writes, we are moving to the Netherlands in November. Does Thun also provide tax advisory services? We have lots of clients in the Netherlands, and we know a lot about some very unique aspects of how the Dutch taxation of investments, Box 3 income, and so on and so forth, interacts with the US taxation of those same investments. So yes, give us a call, and we can tell you all about it. David writes, is a US global address okay? Fidelity and other financial banks and credit card companies accept this. Or is that changing? A US global address?
I think it's like the mailing address, the mail forwarding solution. I mean,
yeah.
Generally that probably is okay. A lot of times these brokerage firms, just so you understand, if they get mail back, returned mail, that really triggers them to go look into what's happening with your situation. So if you have a stale address on your account, you think, oh, I have a US address and I'm good. And then one fine day they send, even though you're full online electronic, and they send out a privacy statement that has to be mailed hard copy, and it comes back to them in the mail because your address is not good, then that's where you're going to start hearing from them.
All right, Kay writes, Phone numbers are used to send verification codes. Indeed, we've run into this. Skype will not work for this purposes. How do you deal with this? Peter?
So yeah, I mean, so I think if you can get one of those Google phone numbers, you can receive text messages on your phone, but I understand you have to set that up when you're in the United States. So another way is just to call the brokerage firms and go through the voice verification process.
Yeah, just calling them is usually an alternative to using that phone verification thing. Do you have any information regarding the account closure restrictions issue with U.S. government retirement accounts such as the Thrift Savings Plan?
I don't specifically.
We have lots of clients with the TSP. I've never heard of anyone saying they're getting kicked out of the TSP because they're abroad.
Right. Yep.
Daniela says, amazing. Thanks for the answer. So glad to hear the amount has come down to 100,000. Great. Love to hear you, Daniela, and we'll get you with the Emerging Wealth team. All right, Ted says, do you charge for an initial consultation review of my situation? No, we don't. Maluk writes, we own a home in the USA, but it is currently rented. Can I still list it as my residential address even though there's someone else living there? Yeah, I think a lot of people do that. And I think it generally will work. Jerome writes, any recommendations for a mail forwarding service? No, we don't really have a recommendation there. Charles writes, how are Bank of America when it comes to these crazy foreign address restrictions? Yeah, we've talked about Bank of America. A lot of people seem to have Bank of America accounts all over the world, so apparently they are not very restrictive for bank accounts. Merrill Lynch, Bank of America is a different story on investment accounts. Please disregard, okay. Charles, okay. Scott writes, okay, we're getting to the end here. Scott writes, U.S. citizen, I opened an HSBC U.S. Prestige account from Dubai yesterday. It took 4 months. I did use a UAE address and a UAE phone. Note, HSBC called here. I have now applied for HSBC Premier MasterCard, same way. Okay, good information. Is a UK SIP a PFIC? No, a SIP is a type of retirement account. A PFIC is an investment. It's a mutual fund or an ETF. A SIP may own a PFIC. That's a common scenario, but don't worry about it because the PFIC is not subject to U.S. taxation because it's inside the wrapper of the SIP, which is covered by treaty. So not a problem, Howard. All right, Albert writes, when Thun manages an account for me, does that include actively selecting and buying investments for me, or does responsibility still fall with me? No, we will pick the investments for you. We will work with you to make sure that you know why we're picking certain investments and what the strategy is, and we'll take your input too, right? Maybe we'll do it jointly. Some people say, hey, you guys are the experts, you take it, I'll take whatever you tell me to do. A lot of people say, hey, yeah, that was a good idea, but I want more of this, I want less of that. So very, very flexible on that. Susan writes, has Vanguard been aggressive in closing or kicking out expats? Peter?
They're not very global in nature, so I know them to strongly prefer to work with U.S. domestic clientele, but I don't hear, at the same time, I don't hear a lot of people getting kicked out of Vanguard, but I think my small experience has been people who had Vanguard accounts tend not to voluntarily update their information and wave the flag that I'm somewhere outside the United States.
Although I have recently spoken with people who said that they're with Vanguard, they're in the UK. I think I spoke with somebody in Germany, and they said that they told Vanguard, and Vanguard was not restricting them in any way. So maybe Vanguard's loosened up a little bit. All right.
They do operate UK though, so that might be an exception, right?
Yeah. Bernard writes, I'm a US-UK dual citizen living in the UK. If I buy a US-based ETF that does not have UK reporting status, is that a no-go zone for US citizens? Is it really bad if I buy a US-based ETF that do not have UK reporting status? Thank you. Well, look, it could be. If you end up selling it with a large gain, you're going to pay 45% tax rate probably instead of 20% tax rate if you're a high income earner or even a moderate income earner. So that's bad. Maybe you never sell it, in which case you move back to the United States or something and you sell it there. So then and it never was a problem. So the problem with non-reporting funds for UK taxation is when you sell them, you get taxed at regular tax rates rather than the preferred 10 to 20% UK capital gains rates. So that's the issue, right?
Just to clarify, your citizenship here, Bernard, doesn't matter. You could be, you know, a French citizen resident in the UK buying US ETFs, same issues apply. So it's about your residency and the UK tax implications, exactly. What you're talking about.
Exactly. All right. Sue writes, if you're a dual citizen US and Switzerland and are going to expatriate and have investments in the US, would you move the investments to UBS International account, for example, before doing that? Thank you. Peter, good question.
Yeah, it's a good question. Like I talked about before in my presentation, be very strategic about the process of giving up US citizenship. You don't want to become a covered expatriate if you can avoid it. And so it's not necessarily only how much in assets you have, but also how good you've been on your tax filing. Now, would I necessarily transfer my assets ahead of expatriation? No, I'd probably do it after the fact. And then even still, what I transfer, well, that's a secondary question. What would be a better outcome for you? Somebody in Switzerland to own US investments or European investments, right? So, well, let's see, are you moving to Switzerland? Yeah, I assume so. You were talking about UBS here and you're Swiss national, but really depends on where you're headed, Sue, on whether you will want to own US investments or non-US investments ultimately. But until you're disconnected from the US, I would just assume keep your investments in the US and then make a decision thereafter.
All right, let's see. Jerome writes, what is the difference in your services between $100,000 and $500,000 level? Yes, right. $100,000 to $500,000, you would work with the emerging wealth team. They are the same team that works with domestic clients in the US. They also work with lots of clients outside the United States, and they know what to do and what not to do with respect to securities and account opening and all that kind of stuff. They don't, however, provide the very detailed expat cross-border financial planning that you get if you have at least $500,000 with us and can work with the Thun team, Jerome. So that's a very brief answer to that. Following up, Jerome also writes, what is your brokerage partner's fee for a quarterly wire to send funds abroad for living expenses? Schwab and Fidelity, they don't charge fees for wires. They may charge a little difference between the wholesale exchange rate and the exchange rate that they charge, but it's very low. So they're very good on this. Shirley writes, this is a good webinar and it is a crisis for me because I'm a Wells Fargo customer. Right, good point, Shirley. That's what we said before. If you're getting your account closed, it is a crisis. Pankaj, is Vanguard closing brokerage accounts even if you have a U.S. address on it? No, if you have a U.S. address on it, and then they're not going to close it, right? Whether or not they'll allow you to keep your U.S. address is the issue. Robert writes, what about someone who moves from mainland U.S. to a U.S. territory such as Puerto Rico or Virgin Islands? Yeah, Robert, I think we answered your question earlier. Charles writes, Wells Fargo were awful to me after the Patriot Act went into effect. They would send income as a cashier's check to my foreign address, just inviting a negotiable instrument to be stolen. There you go. Okay, we're getting almost down to the end here. All right, Merely, I'm a U.S. dual national and have a Wells Fargo bank account, have had it for 25 years with a UK address. They haven't notified me of any changes. Should I do anything? Yeah, I would call them and find out. You might be missing some notifications because we're getting calls here every single day from people saying, I've just been notified that Wells Fargo is closing my account. What should I do? Oh, Merely follows up, says Wells Fargo apparently has decided to keep open accounts of U.S. federal government employees. Am I just lucky? I hadn't heard that one. We'd heard that it was everybody, but I don't know, maybe there are some exceptions. So if that works for you, Merely, great. Okay, so Tyler writes, sorry to clarify, did you say that under some bilateral reporting agreements that the U.S. has agreed to that U.S. citizens are exempt from some reporting? Okay, what I'm referring to, Tyler, here is FATCA, the big law that requires foreign financial institutions to report on holdings held by U.S. citizens in accounts outside the United States, has ancillary agreements called IGAs, intergovernmental agreements. The IGAs are bilateral treaties that the U.S. negotiated to implement FATCA in various countries around the world. And those IGAs include provisions for the U.S., I'll say this again, for the U.S. to provide information to that country about U.S. accounts held by residents of the other country, right? However, if that resident of the other country with the U.S. account is a U.S. citizen, U.S. does not share that information. Okay, so I think I said
it's not a burden on you, Tyler. It was.
All right. If you invest in a passive foreign, this comes from Becky. If you invest in a passive foreign investment company years ago because these laws didn't exist in the 80s and 90s, well, they did. PFIC rules have been around since 1973, Becky. And the tax rate between the two countries means that you pay the higher tax in your country of residence. Are the taxes you pay in the country still credited to you? I live in South Africa. Foreign tax credits can be used to offset passive foreign investment company taxes. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, she's probably accumulated. I would work with the tax preparer to see what the implications that are going to be, though, because you accumulate, right, a lot of
Interest.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, interest actually. Penalties not so much with PFICs because of peculiar rules about those. But yeah. All right. Okay. Okay, we're almost to the end here. Let's try to get through these last ones quickly. Thank you, Peter and David. This webinar has been extremely informative. You're welcome, Cynthia. Okay, Ellen, I know you keep asking questions about your foreign employer pension stock scheme. Just give us a call. It's a complicated issue. It's not really an account closing question, and there's so many circumstantial aspects of that I can't give you an accurate general answer. Herv, hello, and thank you for the presentation. I'm sorry if you've already covered this. I missed the beginning. Just curious about specifics about U.S. citizens living in France as far as holding investment accounts in the U.S. Well, yes, okay. Yeah, well, this whole presentation, go back and watch the replay, is all about U.S. citizens abroad holding U.S. investment accounts, whether they're in France or any other country. So not sure what the question there is, Herb, but we've probably answered it. So listen to the replay. Is the deferred annuity scheme? Oh, yeah, Diane. Yeah, I think we answered that one, Diana. Charles. Oh, sorry. Okay. Mish says, to follow up on the cash question, I heard of a brokerage, i.e. Fidelity, restricting trading, but also doing anything with the cash, like paying margin deposit, debit card transfers. What are the MiFID rules affecting that? Do MiFID rules affect margin or anything like that? Or deposit or cash cards? I don't think so. Peter?
No, I don't know about that. I mean, they have their own, because margin, for example, is a loan, right? So the brokerage firms have their own policies about who they're going to lend to and what regulations control the lending practices. So we face that too with our clients insofar as which countries we can get a debit card in and which countries we cannot, and which countries we can do margin, which we cannot, and what type of margin can we do, and what type of account can you have margin on, et cetera, et cetera. But those aren't specific to MiFID. Those are other rules and regulations and the brokerage's own internal policies that affect those choices.
Right. Robert writes, thank you so much for this webinar, Peter and David. You're welcome. You live in Switzerland and you're wondering if you can safely change your address from on your Schwab account from the U.S. to Switzerland. Yes, you can. I don't think you're gonna have a problem with that, Robert. So I wouldn't discourage you from doing that. You'll be fine. Next question comes from Sergey. How much do you charge to manage a $100,000 IRA account? We charge 1.2% of the value of that portfolio. Do you charge any fees to transfer money from Vanguard to you? No, we don't. Maria, I'm a dual US-UK national living in London. The last place I lived was in the USA in Florida, which does not have a state tax. I'm from New Mexico. My father lives in New Mexico, where he passes, when he passes, and I inherit the bank accounts possible from investments. I'd like to keep Florida as my last USA residence due to taxation. Can I? What else?
The registration is not going to determine the taxation. The good news is here that Americans and UK residents don't pay tax on receiving inheritance, though there is the possibility that if you're inheriting from a US trust that the UK may treat that as income to you. But generally speaking, UK doesn't apply tax to its residents when they receive an inheritance, and the US does not either. Your registration address, whether it's New Mexico, Florida, the UK, or otherwise, is not going to determine the tax outcome of what you described here.
Ken writes, Thun are very experienced on those living abroad. For those under the minimum for Thun, will those investors have access to Thun, or will Thun be our investment advisor? So Karen, if you have less than $500,000, you'll work with the Emerging Wealth Group. We work with the Emerging Wealth Group at a general level to make sure that the advice that they're giving is generally coherent, but it will not give you automatic access to Thun. All right, Wenning writes, thank you, David and Peter. You're welcome, Wenning. All right, okay. Ted says, thank you very much. Okay, okay. One more question here from H2O. Dual citizens have exemption from exit tax if he/she is a tax resident of the other non-U.S. country. What is the IRS's definition of tax resident, e.g. just residency registration at the time of renouncing? Okay, so I think you're talking about expatriation. That's a huge, complex issue. So we're not going to get into that on this presentation, but we do have a webinar on expatriation, and we have a lot on our website about expatriation. So go there for further details. And the last question that we're going to go through today is coming from Wayne, and he says, another great webinar. Thanks. Way to finish it up for us, Wayne. Thank you so much. And thank you for being on, and everyone else for being on. It has been another marathon question and answer session here, but we love doing it. And we're going to do it again in a couple of weeks in August, where we're going to talk about currency. Now, that's a real meaty investment issue. That's what we'd like to get into with our clients. All this account opening stuff, I know it's a big problem for everybody, but let's get beyond that. Just come to Thun. We're going to open up your accounts, and then we're going to start talking about making money in investing, which is what it's really about. Currency, diversification, what stocks, what markets, all that good stuff. And we're going to start next week on those topics with currency, or not next week, next month. So we'll see y'all here then, and looking forward to it. In the meantime, if we didn't get to your question or you need further elaboration, just contact us. We're here all day. We answer the phone, we answer emails, and we talk to everybody. So we're looking forward to hearing from you. All right, thank you. See you on the next webinar.
Take care.